In a world where modern medicine can replace organs, map genomes, and predict inherited disease, one small detail in human blood still remains strangely uneven across the planet. A blood type called Rh negative appears in only a minority of people, yet it has inspired centuries of questions, suspicion, folklore, and scientific curiosity. Some claimed it was evidence of lost civilizations. Others connected it to royalty, migration, or even forces beyond human history. But the colder truth may be far more unsettling. After decades of research, science still cannot fully explain why this blood factor disappeared in some populations, while remaining dominant in others. And if something so fundamental in human biology still carries unanswered patterns from the ancient world, what else inside the human story have we misunderstood all along? In the early years of the 20th century, blood was still mysterious in ways that are difficult to imagine today. Doctors had already learned that human blood could be separated into different groups, thanks to the work of Austrian scientist Karl Landsteiner, who identified the ABO blood system in 1901. That discovery changed medicine forever. Before it, blood transfusions often felt like blind experiments. Some patients survived, others died suddenly for reasons nobody fully understood. Once doctors realized that blood carried invisible differences from person to person, transfusions became safer, and modern medicine quietly stepped into a new era. Yet even after the ABO system was mapped, strange medical tragedies continued to happen. Healthy mothers sometimes lost newborn children without warning. Infants who appeared normal at birth would suddenly become dangerously ill. Physicians watched helplessly as jaundice spread across tiny bodies, sometimes leading to brain damage or death. In many cases, nobody could explain why one pregnancy seemed ordinary, while another became fatal. For centuries, people blamed curses, weak constitutions, bad air, divine punishment, or fate itself. The true answer remained hidden inside the blood. During the 1930s and early 1940s, researchers searching for answers began studying reactions between animal blood and human blood. One experiment involved rhesus monkeys, whose blood cells were used in laboratory testing. Scientists noticed that many human blood samples reacted to a particular factor found in those monkeys. Others did not. The distinction seemed small at first, almost technical, but it pointed toward an entirely separate blood classification system beyond ABO. Researchers eventually named it the Rh factor, referencing the rhesus monkey experiments that helped reveal it. People who carried the factor became known as Rh positive. Those without it became Rh negative. The discovery sounded simple, but its consequences reached deeply into medicine, childbirth, and human history. Suddenly, doctors understood why certain pregnancies became dangerous. If an Rh negative mother carried an Rh positive child, her immune system could sometimes recognize the baby's blood cells as foreign. During pregnancy or childbirth, small amounts of fetal blood might enter the mother's bloodstream. Her body could respond by creating antibodies. In later pregnancies, those antibodies might attack another Rh-positive fetus. Before medical treatment existed, this condition caused enormous suffering. Entire families experienced repeated infant deaths without ever understanding the biological reason hidden beneath generations of grief. The strange thing was that Rh-negative blood did not appear evenly across humanity. In some populations it was extremely rare. In others, especially certain parts of Europe, it appeared much more often. Scientists slowly realized they were looking at something older than modern nations, older than written history, perhaps connected to ancient migrations and isolated populations stretching back thousands of years. A tiny missing protein on the surface of red blood cells had unexpectedly become part of a much larger human story. For most people alive before the 20th century, blood was symbolic long before it was scientific. Ancient cultures connected blood with identity, inheritance, spirit, family, and destiny. Kings protected royal bloodlines. Tribes traced ancestry through blood memory. Religious rituals treated blood as sacred, dangerous, or transformative. Yet none of those civilizations knew that inside the body existed microscopic markers capable of shaping life and death in silence. Long before laboratories and microscopes, people were already building myths around something they could not see. And perhaps that is what makes the Rh mystery feel so strangely powerful even now. Not because it proves supernatural claims or hidden origins, but because it reminds us how recently humanity began understanding the biology carried inside every human vein, and how many generations lived and died while the answers remained invisible. For most of human history, childbirth existed beside uncertainty in a way modern societies rarely experience anymore. Even in peaceful villages, even inside wealthy households, pregnancy carried quiet danger. A mother could survive several births without complication and then suddenly lose a child for reasons nobody could explain. Midwives recorded patterns they did not understand. Some families seemed haunted by repeated infant deaths, while neighboring households remained untouched generation after generation. In many cultures, people searched for meaning in religion, astrology, inherited curses, or moral failure. Very few imagined that the explanation might rest in microscopic structures moving silently through the bloodstream. Before the discovery of the Rh factor, doctors often described certain newborn illnesses in vague and tragic language. Babies appeared healthy at first, then gradually developed yellow skin and unusual weakness. Some stopped feeding, others suffered seizures or severe anemia. Physicians named the condition erythroblastosis fetalis, though understanding the true mechanism came slowly. The disease looked unpredictable because the danger depended on a hidden incompatibility between mother and child. In an age before blood typing became routine, these invisible biological differences remained almost impossible to anticipate. One pregnancy could pass safely, while the next carried serious risk. This uncertainty created an atmosphere of helplessness that shaped family life more deeply than many modern people realize. Long before hospitals became common, mothers often approached childbirth with a mixture of hope and restrained fear. In ancient and medieval societies, entire rituals developed around pregnancy protection. Amulets were worn, special prayers were spoken, protective symbols were painted near beds or doorways. These traditions varied across civilizations, but they shared one underlying reality. People knew life could disappear suddenly during childbirth, and they lacked the tools to understand why. The mystery surrounding blood only intensified that fear. Blood had always occupied a strange place in human imagination. It symbolized family, inheritance, continuity, and sacrifice. At the same time, it could carry illness and death. Once physicians discovered that human blood itself contained invisible differences, older symbolic beliefs about blood began colliding with modern science. The Rh factor became one more reminder that the body contained hidden systems operating beneath ordinary human awareness. By the mid-20th century, researchers gradually pieced together the mechanism behind Rh incompatibility. An Rh-negative individual lacks a specific protein called the D antigen on the surface of red blood cells. If an Rh-negative mother is exposed to Rh-positive fetal blood, her immune system may treat those cells as foreign invaders. Antibodies can then form against them. During a later pregnancy with another RuPrau-positive child, those antibodies may cross the placenta and attack the fetus's red blood cells. Today, medicine can usually prevent this with injections such as Rogam, introduced in the late 1960s. But for thousands of years before that breakthrough, families had no protection against a process they could neither see nor predict. This was not mythology. It was biology unfolding silently across generations. The deeper scientists investigated the Rh factor. The stranger the global patterns appeared. Rh-positive blood dominated most of the human population. Rh-negative blood remained comparatively uncommon worldwide, yet certain regions displayed much higher concentrations than others. The distribution did not follow simple national borders or political histories. Instead, it hinted at older population movements shaped by migration, isolation, survival, and ancestry. Questions naturally followed. Why had this variation persisted for so long? If Rh-negative blood could create reproductive complications under certain conditions, why had evolution not eliminated it entirely? Science offered partial explanations involving genetics and population drift, but not every detail fit neatly into place. And wherever science leaves small spaces of uncertainty, stories tend to grow. Over time, those unanswered spaces would attract myths, speculation, and extraordinary claims far beyond the evidence itself. Yet, beneath all the future, theories remained a quieter and more human reality. Countless people throughout history experienced the consequences of Rh incompatibility without ever knowing the invisible factor inside their own blood. As the 20th century continued, the discovery of the Rh factor quietly changed the way scientists viewed human populations. At first, the research focused mainly on medicine. Doctors wanted safer pregnancies, safer transfusions, and fewer unexplained infant deaths. Yet once blood typing expanded across different countries and ethnic groups, researchers noticed patterns that seemed to reach far beyond hospitals. Human blood was not distributed randomly across the world. Certain traits appeared more often in some regions than others, almost like ancient fingerprints left behind by migration and isolation over thousands of years. Rh-negative blood became one of the most curious examples. In many parts of Asia and Africa, Rh-negative blood remained extremely rare. In Europe, however, the numbers rose significantly. Some communities showed especially high frequencies, far above the global average. To geneticists, these patterns were not supernatural evidence, they were clues. Every human population carries traces of its past inside its DNA. Long before written language existed, long before kingdoms or borders formed, small groups of humans travelled across continents, settled in isolated regions, survived disease, endured climate change, and passed their genes into future generations. Over time, certain traits became more common simply because populations remained separated from one another for long periods. Rh-negative blood appeared to be connected to that deeper human story. The more scientists studied genetics, the more they understood that evolution does not create perfect systems. Many people imagine evolution as a force constantly moving toward improvement, but biology is rarely so tidy. Some traits survive not because they are superior, but because they are neutral enough to remain in a population without disappearing. Others persist because they once carried advantages in ancient environments that no longer exist. In the case of Rh-negative blood, researchers still debate exactly why the trait remained relatively common in some groups, despite the reproductive complications linked to Rh incompatibility. No single explanation has solved every question. That uncertainty became fertile ground for speculation. During the late 20th century, especially with the rise of television documentaries and the early internet, Rh-negative blood slowly drifted beyond medical science into popular fascination. Articles began appearing that described it as mysterious or unusual. Amateur theorists connected it to lost civilizations, forgotten ancestors, secret royal bloodlines, and eventually even extraterrestrial origin stories. Most of these claims lacked scientific evidence, but they spread widely because they touched something deeply human, the desire to feel connected to hidden meaning. Blood already carried enormous symbolic weight throughout history. Once a rare blood type entered public imagination, myths formed almost automatically around it. Yet the real scientific story remained quieter and, in some ways, more profound. Human beings are ancient travelers. Modern populations are mosaics created by countless migrations, disasters, separations, and reunions stretching across tens of thousands of years. Small genetic differences sometimes survive simply because history unfolded unevenly. Mountains isolated communities, oceans slowed contact, wars destroyed lineages while famine strengthened others through survival alone. Inside modern blood systems, researchers occasionally glimpse echoes of those ancient movements. Rh-negative blood may not be evidence of hidden species or supernatural ancestry, but it does remind us that the human past is still physically present inside living bodies. Every person carries biological memories far older than any nation or empire. What makes the Rh factor especially fascinating is how recently humanity discovered it. For thousands of years, people inherited these blood patterns without understanding them. Ancient mothers feared difficult births without knowing why some pregnancies became dangerous. Families passed traits across generations without realizing invisible markers traveled with them. Entire civilizations built myths about sacred blood, while remaining unaware of the microscopic structures flowing through every human vein. The discovery of Rh-negative blood revealed more than a medical detail. It exposed how much of human history unfolded in ignorance of the body itself. And as scientists continued mapping the distribution of Rh-negative populations across the world, an unsettling possibility slowly emerged. Perhaps certain blood patterns were preserving traces of ancient migrations that history books had already forgotten. To understand why Rh-negative blood appears so unevenly across the world, scientists first had to examine something far smaller than history itself: Deep inside human cells lies a set of genetic instructions responsible for building proteins on the surface of red blood cells. One of those instructions involves the RHD gene, which helps determine whether a person carries the Rh factor. If the gene produces the D antigen, the individual is classified as Rh positive. If the antigen is absent, the person is Rh negative. From a biological perspective, the distinction sounds remarkably small. A tiny protein either exists or it does not. Yet this microscopic difference has shaped pregnancies, medical procedures, and scientific debate for decades. Human genetics often works quietly in the background of ordinary life. Most people never think about inherited traits until medicine forces attention toward them. Eye color, height, hair texture, and blood type pass through generations almost invisibly, carried forward through combinations of parental DNA. Rh negative inheritance follows that same quiet process. In general terms, a child must inherit altered or inactive versions of the RHD gene from both parents to be Rh negative. If even one active version is inherited, the Rh positive trait usually appears instead. Because Rh positive inheritance tends to dominate genetically, Rh negative blood remains less common overall. Scientists estimate that roughly 85% of the world's population is Rh positive, though the numbers vary dramatically depending on region and ancestry. In East Asia, Rh negative blood is exceptionally rare, often appearing in less than 1% of the population. Across much of Africa, the percentage also remains relatively low. Europe presents a different picture. In some European populations, Rh negative frequency rises to around 15% or more. Certain isolated groups display even higher concentrations. To population geneticists, these differences are not random accidents. They are traces of human movement across ancient landscapes. Thousands of years ago, human populations were much smaller than they are today. Small communities often remained separated by mountains, forests, deserts, or seas. When groups stayed isolated long enough, particular genetic traits could become unusually common through a process known as genetic drift. Unlike natural selection, which favors traits linked to survival or reproduction, genetic drift can increase or decrease traits simply through chance within smaller populations. A rare gene carried by a few ancestors might gradually spread through an isolated community over generations without offering any special advantage at all. This idea helps explain why some unusual genetic characteristics cluster in specific regions. Rh negative blood may be one example of that ancient biological drift. Yet the mystery does not disappear entirely. Some researchers continue asking why the trait persisted across thousands of years despite the reproductive risks associated with Rh incompatibility before modern medicine. Evolution usually reduces traits that strongly threaten reproduction. Rh negative blood survived anyway. That does not mean it possesses supernatural significance. Biology is rarely simple enough for one clean explanation. Many inherited traits exist within populations because the disadvantages are limited, inconsistent, or balanced by other factors scientists may not fully understand yet. Nature does not operate like careful engineering. It preserves countless variations across human populations, many of which remain only partially explained. The public fascination with Rh negative blood often begins precisely at this point, where certainty fades into probability. Once people hear that a blood type is both relatively rare and unevenly distributed across the globe, imagination naturally fills the remaining gaps. Questions emerge almost automatically. Why do some regions carry more Rh negative ancestry than others? Could ancient migration routes still be visible inside modern blood patterns? How many forgotten populations disappeared while leaving only faint genetic traces behind? These questions belong to science, history, and anthropology far more than mythology. Still, they carry an emotional weight because they touch a deeper human desire to understand where we came from and whether the body itself might still remember parts of the ancient world that civilization has already forgotten. When scientists began mapping Rh negative blood across the globe, the patterns looked less like a modern political map and more like fragments of a forgotten human journey. The percentages shifted gradually from region to region, almost as though ancient populations had carried invisible signatures with them while moving across continents thousands of years ago. In most of East Asia, Rh negative blood remained extremely uncommon. Countries such as China, Japan, and Korea reported very low frequencies, often below 1%. Similar patterns appeared across many indigenous populations of the Americas. In large parts of Africa, Rh-negative blood also stayed relatively rare compared to Europe. Yet as researchers moved westward across the map toward Europe, the numbers slowly increased. In some regions, Rh-negative blood appeared in roughly 1 out of every 6 or 7 people. This uneven distribution fascinated population geneticists because blood markers can sometimes preserve traces of ancient isolation long after languages, borders, and empires disappear. Europe itself contains many layers of human migration. Long before recorded history, waves of hunter-gatherers, early farmers, and later nomadic groups moved through the continent over thousands of years. Some populations mixed heavily. Others remained relatively isolated due to geography. Mountain ranges, coastal valleys, and difficult terrain often created pockets where communities lived with limited outside contact for centuries. Inside those isolated groups, rare genetic traits sometimes became concentrated through inheritance alone. Rh-negative blood may have followed that pattern in certain parts of Europe. Among the most discussed examples are the Basque people, who live in regions spanning northern Spain and southwestern France near the Pyrenees Mountains. For decades, scientists noticed that Basque populations showed unusually high frequencies of Rh-negative blood compared to many neighbouring groups. The exact numbers vary between studies, but the pattern remained consistent enough to attract international attention. The Basques also possessed another feature that intrigued researchers even more: their language. Euskara, the Basque language, does not belong clearly to the Indo-European language family that dominates most of Europe. Linguists have long considered it one of the continent's most unusual surviving languages, possibly preserving elements of very ancient cultural ancestry. This combination of linguistic isolation and distinctive blood patterns encouraged speculation about deep historical continuity. Some researchers proposed that the Basques might preserve genetic traces from very early European populations that existed before later migration waves reshaped much of the continent. Importantly, mainstream science does not treat the Basques as a mysterious lost civilization or separate species. Genetic studies show they are fully human and closely related to surrounding European populations. Their distinctiveness appears to result mainly from long periods of relative isolation rather than supernatural origin. Still, the persistence of unusual traits over such long stretches of time reminds scientists how powerfully geography can shape human genetics. Mountains can preserve biological patterns almost as effectively as they preserve ancient languages or traditions. Rh-negative blood becomes more interesting in this context because it behaves almost like a quiet historical echo. Unlike monuments or written records, blood carries no conscious memory. It simply moves through generations unnoticed. A child inherits it without knowing the migrations, famines, marriages, or isolated communities that may have shaped its distribution centuries earlier. Modern laboratories can measure these patterns statistically, but statistics alone cannot fully capture the immense span of human time hidden beneath them. The fascination surrounding Rh-negative blood often grows strongest where science becomes cautious. Researchers can explain inheritance, mutation, and population drift with reasonable confidence. They can compare frequencies between populations and reconstruct ancient migration patterns through genetics. Yet no scientist can point to a single dramatic moment when Rh-negative blood first appeared. The mutation itself likely emerged deep in prehistory, long before written records existed. Its earliest carriers lived and died anonymously in worlds now lost to archaeology and time. Perhaps that uncertainty explains why Rh-negative blood inspires so much imagination. It is not merely a medical category. It feels like a small surviving clue from humanity's oldest chapters, preserved invisibly inside the body, while nearly everything else from those distant eras vanished into silence. To modern people living in connected societies, it is easy to forget how isolated human communities once were. Today, airplanes cross oceans in hours, languages spread instantly through screens, and millions of people move between countries every year. Ancient populations experienced a completely different reality. For most of human existence, travel was slow, dangerous, and limited by geography. Entire groups could remain separated for centuries by mountains, rivers, forests, deserts, or winter climates. In that isolation, small genetic variations sometimes survived and multiplied almost unnoticed. Rh-negative blood may be one of those ancient variations carried quietly through generations of separated human communities. Genetic drift helps explain how this process works. Imagine a small village thousands of years ago containing only a few dozen families. If several members happen to carry the genes associated with Rh negative inheritance, the trait could slowly become more common over generations, especially if the community remained relatively isolated from outsiders. This would not require special powers, hidden civilizations, or dramatic evolutionary advantages. Chance alone can strongly shape genetics when populations stay small long enough. In larger populations, unusual traits often become diluted through constant mixing. In isolated populations, they can persist surprisingly well. Scientists have observed similar patterns with many inherited traits around the world. Certain rare genetic conditions cluster within island populations. Some physical characteristics appear frequently in remote valleys while remaining uncommon elsewhere. Human history is filled with these biological echoes of isolation. The Rh factor fits naturally into that larger pattern. Yet what makes Rh negative blood especially fascinating is the timescale involved. Some isolated populations maintain distinctive traits across thousands of years. Generations rose and disappeared while the underlying genetic signals remained. Long after languages changed or kingdoms collapsed, blood markers sometimes continued traveling silently through family lines. This creates an unusual relationship between biology and memory. Written history records wars, rulers, religions, and borders. Genetics preserves something older and quieter, ancestry itself. Scientists studying ancient DNA increasingly describe humanity as a constantly moving network of populations splitting apart and reconnecting across enormous stretches of time. No civilization emerged in complete isolation forever. Human groups migrated repeatedly due to climate shifts, food shortages, conflict, curiosity, and survival. Still, some regions remained comparatively stable for longer periods, allowing certain genetic traits to become unusually concentrated. The Basque region is one example often discussed in relation to Rh negative frequency, but similar principles apply elsewhere throughout human history. Isolation does not freeze populations completely. It simply slows the mixing process enough for distinctive patterns to emerge. This understanding changed how scientists approached blood research during the 20th century. Blood types became more than medical categories. They evolved into tools for studying ancient migration and population history. Before modern genome sequencing existed, researchers used blood group frequencies to estimate relationships between human populations. The methods were limited compared to modern genetics, but they revealed an important truth. Invisible biological patterns could sometimes preserve evidence of human movement across prehistoric landscapes. Rh negative blood entered scientific curiosity, partly because it seemed to follow these older migration pathways rather than modern political boundaries. The public often misunderstands what this means. A blood type cannot determine personality, intelligence, destiny, or spiritual importance. Science does not support claims that Rh negative individuals are fundamentally separate from the rest of humanity. All humans share overwhelmingly similar genetics. The differences between populations are small compared to the enormous biological similarities uniting the species. Still, those small differences matter historically because they help researchers reconstruct forgotten chapters of the human journey. Rh negative blood becomes meaningful, not as proof of superiority or mystery species, but as evidence that ancient isolation and migration left measurable traces inside living populations. In a strange way, every human body functions like a moving archive. Bones preserve evidence of nutrition and labor. DNA preserves fragments of ancestry. Blood carries inherited systems shaped by events that modern individuals will never consciously remember. Somewhere in prehistoric time, long before written language recorded names or kingdoms, the genetic variation associated with Rh negative blood emerged and survived. Its earliest carriers walk through worlds now buried beneath thousands of years of human change. Nothing remains of their voices or daily lives. Yet the biological trace continued forward through history, quietly reaching into the modern age. Long before cities, nations, or written history existed, small groups of humans moved slowly across an unfamiliar planet. They traveled through frozen valleys, crossed grasslands filled with giant animals, followed rivers into unknown territory, and survived climates that changed across centuries rather than seasons. Modern genetic research suggests that all living humans share remarkably recent common ancestry when viewed across the immense scale of evolutionary time. Yet the journey from those ancient ancestors to the modern world was not simple or direct. Humanity spread outward in waves, separated repeatedly into isolated populations, and then mixed together again in ways that still shape human biology today. Somewhere within those ancient migrations, the genetic variation associated with Rh-negative blood quietly endured. During the last ice age, enormous ice sheets covered large parts of northern Europe and North America. Temperatures were colder, sea levels lower, and many regions that are populated today were difficult or impossible to inhabit. Human groups survived by adapting carefully to local environments. Some remained in warmer refuges for thousands of years while glaciers dominated the north. Others followed migrating animals across open steppe landscapes that no longer exist in the same form today. These populations were often small by modern standards. A few hundred individuals, or even fewer, might represent an entire regional community. Under such conditions, genetic drift became powerful. Traits carried by a limited number of ancestors could become concentrated simply because the population itself remained small and isolated. Scientists believe that many modern European populations partly descend from Ice Age hunter-gatherers who survived in southern refuges before gradually expanding northward again as glaciers retreated. Genetic evidence suggests that these ancient groups did not remain completely separate forever. Later migrations from early farming societies and steppe pastoralists reshaped the continent repeatedly. Europe became a layered mosaic of ancestry formed across thousands of years. Yet some regions preserved stronger traces of older populations than others. Mountains, coastlines, and isolated valleys slowed cultural and biological mixing. Rh-negative blood may have persisted more strongly in certain populations because of these ancient periods of relative separation. The important point is that no single migration created modern humanity. Human history resembles overlapping waves rather than a straight line. Ancient DNA studies reveal populations appearing, disappearing, mixing, and moving continuously across prehistoric landscapes. Some groups vanished almost completely. Others survived only as partial genetic echoes inside later populations. Entire cultures left no written records because writing itself had not yet been invented. In many cases, bones, tools, and DNA are the only remaining evidence that those people ever existed at all. This perspective changes how scientists think about inherited traits like Rh-negative blood. Instead of viewing them as isolated mysteries, researchers often see them as fragments of a much larger human story involving survival, adaptation, and migration across immense stretches of time. There is something quietly unsettling about this idea. Most people imagine history beginning with civilizations, kings, monuments, or famous battles. Genetics points toward a deeper timeline, where anonymous human lives shaped the future long before recorded memory existed. Somewhere in a prehistoric camp, beside a river or beneath a cold Ice Age sky, individuals carrying the Rh-negative variation lived ordinary lives without knowing their blood would one day become a scientific curiosity thousands of years later. They hunted, traveled, raised children, survived illness, and disappeared into time. Yet small biological traces continued forward through generations that had no awareness of the ancient origins hidden inside them. Modern science can reconstruct parts of these movements through statistical models and genetic comparisons, but many uncertainties remain. Ancient DNA research is still developing, and new discoveries regularly reshape older assumptions about population history. This uncertainty matters because it reminds us that human ancestry is extraordinarily complex. There is rarely a single origin point for any widespread genetic trait. Rh-negative blood likely survived through multiple populations and migrations rather than one mysterious lost civilization. The deeper scientists investigate the ancient human past, the more they discover a world defined not by isolated myths, but by constant movement, separation, survival, and reconnection. And hidden quietly within that endless migration, the story of Rh-negative blood continued traveling forward through time. One of the most powerful forces shaping human genetics is not intelligence, technology, or even survival itself. It is isolation. Throughout history, communities separated from the outside world, often develop distinctive biological patterns simply because their choices for marriage and reproduction remained limited across generations. Scientists call one version of this process the founder effect. It occurs when a small group breaks away from a larger population and carries only part of the original genetic diversity with it. Over time, certain traits inside that smaller group can become far more common than they were at the beginning. In ancient societies, this happened naturally again and again. A handful of families might settle in a remote valley, on an island, or along a difficult coastline. Centuries later, their descendants could still carry unusual genetic frequencies inherited from those first settlers. Rarest negative blood may have followed similar pathways through isolated human populations. The founder effect is easier to understand through simple chance. Imagine a large population where Rh negative blood exists at a relatively low frequency. If a small number of people leave that population, and several happen to carry the Rh negative trait, the new isolated group may begin with a much higher percentage than the original population. Once isolation continues for many generations, the trait can remain unusually concentrated. No hidden design is necessary. The process emerges naturally from inheritance combined with limited population size. Scientists have documented similar effects in many places around the world. Certain inherited disorders appear more frequently among isolated island communities. Remote mountain populations sometimes preserve rare traits, almost absent elsewhere. Human biology often reflects ancient geography more than modern political identity. In prehistoric times, isolation could last for astonishing lengths of time. Harsh winters, dangerous terrain, and limited transportation prevented frequent contact between distant communities. Even neighboring valleys sometimes developed partially distinct genetic patterns if travel remained difficult enough. Archaeologists studying ancient Europe often describe populations that lived relatively stable lives within specific regions for centuries before major migration waves arrived. During those long stretches of partial separation, inherited traits like Rh negative blood could slowly become established within local populations. This perspective helps explain why some modern genetic distributions appear uneven today. The human past was not evenly connected. It was fragmented, local, and deeply shaped by geography. Ancient people did not experience themselves as part of one unified global civilization. Most lived and died within relatively small social worlds. Their descendants inherited not only language and tradition, but also subtle biological patterns created through generations of local ancestry. Rh negative blood becomes intriguing, partly because it preserves traces of that forgotten fragmentation. Modern populations look connected on maps, but genetics still carries memories of older separations hidden beneath the surface. Some researchers believe the Rh negative trait may have spread through certain Ice Age refuge populations in Europe before later migrations redistributed it across the continent. Others emphasize the role of repeated founder effects occurring independently in different isolated communities. Science has not fully settled every detail, partly because ancient population history itself remains incredibly complicated. DNA evidence continues reshaping older models of migration almost every decade. New discoveries regularly reveal that prehistoric populations mixed more often and in more complex ways than earlier researchers assumed. Yet despite these uncertainties, one principle remains clear. Small, isolated groups can preserve unusual genetic patterns for very long periods of time. This idea carries an almost haunting quality when viewed across thousands of years. Entire populations can disappear culturally while fragments of their biology survive inside later generations. Languages vanish, rituals disappear, settlements collapse. Yet inherited markers continue quietly through family lines without anyone recognizing their ancient origins. Rh negative blood may represent one of those surviving traces, not because it points toward mythical ancestors, but because human history itself is far older and more fragmented than most people instinctively imagine. In many ways, modern genetics reveals a humbling truth. The past did not vanish completely. Pieces of it remain active inside living bodies. Every inherited trait carries echoes of decisions, migrations, isolations, and survivals stretching backward through time beyond ordinary memory. The mystery surrounding Rh negative blood grows not from fantasy, but from the realization that even now, humanity is still learning how much ancient history survives hidden beneath the surface of ordinary biology. For most of history, Once a civilization disappeared, people assumed its story disappeared with it. Cities collapsed beneath sand or forest, languages faded into silence, names vanished from memory. Ancient populations that left no monuments often disappeared completely from historical awareness. Modern genetics changed that understanding in a profound way. Scientists eventually realized that the human body itself preserves fragments of forgotten history. DNA can survive long after buildings and kingdoms are gone. Through ancient bones, preserved teeth, and genetic sequencing, researchers began uncovering evidence of populations nobody remembered anymore. Some groups left almost no written trace, yet pieces of their ancestry still survive inside living people today. This discovery transformed genetics into something more than biology. It became a tool for reading the deep human past. During the last few decades, advances in ancient DNA research revealed that prehistoric humanity was far more complex than earlier historians imagined. Europe alone experienced multiple major migration waves across thousands of years. Hunter-gatherers who survived the Ice Age were later joined and partly replaced by early farming populations moving from Anatolia and the Near East. After them came migrations from steppe pastoralist groups connected to regions north of the Black and Caspian Seas. Each wave mixed with earlier populations rather than erasing them completely. Modern Europeans carry varying proportions of ancestry from all these ancient groups. Similar patterns appear across much of the world. Human history is not a clean sequence of replacement. It is a constant layering of populations over immense stretches of time. Blood markers such as the Rh factor became part of this larger investigation because they sometimes preserve hints about those ancient demographic patterns. Scientists no longer rely on blood groups alone to reconstruct ancestry, since full genome analysis provides far more detail, but blood systems still offer useful clues about population history. Rh, negative blood, remains especially interesting because of its uneven distribution and persistence across certain regions. Researchers continue debating exactly how ancient migration, isolation, and genetic drift shaped its spread. No single prehistoric event fully explains it. Instead, the Rh negative trait likely traveled through multiple human populations across many generations of migration and isolation combined. There is something strangely intimate about this kind of history. Traditional history usually focuses on famous individuals, empires, or wars. Genetic history operates differently. It studies anonymous people whose names disappeared tens of thousands of years ago, yet whose descendants still exist. Somewhere in prehistoric Europe, ancient communities survived harsh winters, buried their dead, raised children, and slowly passed inherited traits into the future, without any awareness that modern scientists would one day study those patterns in laboratories. Rh negative blood becomes compelling, partly because it connects ordinary modern individuals to those forgotten lives in a direct biological way, not symbolically, literally. At the same time, science also places important limits on interpretation. Genetics can reveal relationships, probabilities, and population movements, but it does not support fantasies about pure bloodlines or superior ancestry. Human populations have mixed continuously throughout history. The idea of isolated, perfect lineages surviving unchanged across millennia does not match modern genetic evidence. Even groups considered relatively isolated still show extensive connections to neighboring populations over long periods of time. This matters because the mystery surrounding Rh negative blood sometimes attracts exaggerated claims that go far beyond science itself. The real story is quieter, but perhaps more meaningful. Human beings are connected through countless forgotten migrations stretching deep into prehistory. Every population carries traces of earlier worlds now lost to time. Ancient DNA research continues uncovering evidence that many modern people descend from groups whose existence was unknown only a few decades ago. In that sense, the body functions almost like an archaeological site. Layers of ancestry remain hidden beneath ordinary life, waiting to be interpreted carefully through science. And perhaps this explains why blood has always carried such emotional power across civilizations. Long before genetics existed, people sensed that blood connected generations together in ways they could not fully explain. Royal families guarded bloodlines. Tribes traced kinship through ancestry. Ancient myths treated blood as a vessel of inheritance, memory, and destiny. They lack scientific language, yet they recognize something fundamental. Human identity travels through generations invisibly. Modern genetics eventually confirmed that intuition, though in forms far more complex and humbling than ancient people ever imagined. Long before science understood genes, chromosomes, or blood groups, human societies already believed that blood carried something deeper than physical life alone. Across ancient civilizations, blood became a symbol of inheritance, identity, legitimacy, and power. Families passed down names, land, rituals, and authority through bloodlines. Kings claimed divine ancestry through blood. Priests spoke of sacred lineage. Noble houses guarded family purity through carefully arranged marriages. Although ancient people had no understanding of genetics in the modern sense, they observed that traits often traveled through generations. Children resembled parents. Illness sometimes appeared repeatedly within certain families. Temperament, appearance, and social status all seemed connected to ancestry. Over time, blood itself became the language societies used to describe those inherited connections. In ancient Egypt, royal bloodlines were closely protected because pharaohs were considered divine or semi-divine figures. Marriages between relatives sometimes occurred within ruling families, partly to preserve dynastic continuity and sacred legitimacy. Similar patterns appeared elsewhere throughout history. European noble houses tracked lineage obsessively. Aristocratic families across Asia and the Middle East often treated ancestry as political currency. Bloodlines determined inheritance, alliances, and claims to power. In many societies, the idea of good blood or pure blood became deeply woven into cultural identity long before anyone understood biology scientifically. These beliefs were not based on modern genetics, but they reflected an ancient intuition that inheritance mattered profoundly. The symbolic importance of blood grew stronger, because blood itself feels mysterious to human beings. It moves unseen beneath the skin, yet injury reveals it instantly. A person can lose consciousness from losing too much of it. Families literally share blood through ancestry. Ancient people often viewed blood as carrying life force, spirit, or sacred essence, because its importance seemed undeniable even without scientific explanation. Religious rituals involving blood appeared across civilizations. Oaths were sealed in blood. Sacrifices involved blood. Wars were fought over bloodline succession. Entire political systems developed around inherited family legitimacy. The modern fascination with unusual blood types, including Rh-negative blood, partly grows from these older symbolic traditions. Even today, people instinctively associate blood with identity and hidden inheritance. Yet history also reveals the dangers of attaching too much meaning to bloodline ideas. Royal families that tried to preserve pure ancestry through generations of intermarriage often suffered serious genetic consequences. The Habsburg dynasty in Europe became one famous example. Over centuries, repeated marriages between close relatives increased the frequency of inherited disorders within the family line. Modern genetics later explained why this happened. Limiting genetic diversity increases the likelihood that harmful recessive traits will appear more frequently. Ancient rulers believed they were protecting noble blood. In reality, they were sometimes weakening their own descendants biologically. This irony exposes an important truth about human understanding of inheritance before modern science. People sensed that blood mattered, but they misunderstood many of the mechanisms involved. When modern blood typing emerged during the 20th century, old symbolic ideas about blood unexpectedly collided with scientific discovery. Suddenly, blood differences were measurable. They were no longer purely metaphorical or religious concepts. Laboratories could identify invisible biological variations between individuals and populations. Rh, negative blood, entered public imagination during this transition between ancient symbolism and modern genetics. Because it was relatively rare and unevenly distributed, many people began attaching deeper meaning to it almost immediately. Some imagined it represented ancient nobility. Others connected it to hidden ancestry or forgotten civilizations. Most of these interpretations lacked scientific evidence, but they reflected a very old human habit. Whenever societies encounter unexplained differences connected to blood, stories emerge around them. The deeper reality is both simpler and more complicated. Human inheritance does shape populations across time, but not according to myths of purity or destiny. Genetics reveals continuous mixing, migration, and adaptation across human history. No bloodline remains untouched by time forever. Still, ancient obsessions with lineage were not entirely irrational either. Blood does carry history forward biologically. Every generation inherits fragments of the past through DNA and ancestry. Ancient people recognized that continuity intuitively, even though they lacked the scientific tools to understand its true complexity. And as modern researchers continued studying Rh-negative populations, the ancient human fascination with special bloodlines quietly returned in new forms shaped by science, speculation, and the enduring mystery of ancestry itself. Throughout history, ruling families often lived inside worlds far smaller than the empires they controlled. Royal marriage was rarely based on romance alone. It was political, strategic, and deeply concerned with preserving power across generations. Kings married daughters of allied dynasties. Noble houses negotiated unions to protect territory, wealth, and succession rights. Over centuries, this created networks of interconnected bloodlines, stretching across entire continents. In Europe especially, many royal families became biologically linked through repeated intermarriage. By the 19th century, some monarchs who ruled different nations were still close relatives genetically. Ancient societies believed this protected legitimacy. Modern genetics later revealed a more complicated reality. When populations remain socially isolated and repeatedly reproduce within limited family networks, certain inherited traits can become concentrated over time. Royal bloodlines unintentionally created their own form of genetic isolation. The Habsburg dynasty offers one of the clearest historical examples. For generations, Habsburg rulers arranged marriages between cousins and close relatives to maintain political control within the family. Portraits from later centuries reveal physical features now associated with inherited genetic concentration, including the famous Habsburg jaw. Historical records also describe fertility problems, illness, and developmental disorders appearing more frequently over time. King Charles II of Spain, the final Habsburg ruler of the Spanish line, suffered severe physical and cognitive difficulties, linked partly to generations of inbreeding. None of this happened because royal blood was cursed or mystical. It happened because biology responds predictably to reduced genetic diversity. Traits that remain hidden in larger populations can emerge more often when close relatives repeatedly reproduce together. This historical pattern matters when discussing Rh-negative blood because human beings often confuse rarity with importance. Whenever a trait appears uncommon, especially within influential families or isolated groups, stories quickly form around it. In earlier centuries, royal families encouraged myths of special ancestry intentionally. Many rulers claimed descent from gods, legendary heroes, or sacred bloodlines to strengthen political authority. Ordinary people often accepted these stories because power itself appeared mysterious. Kings lived differently, dressed differently, and sometimes seemed separated from common humanity entirely. Blood became a symbolic explanation for that separation. Once modern science identified measurable blood differences, older instincts about special blood naturally resurfaced in new forms. Rh-negative blood attracted fascination partly because it combined rarity with uncertainty. Some people began speculating that unusual blood types might connect to ancient nobility or hidden lineages. Yet science provides no evidence that Rh-negative individuals belong to superior ancestral lines. Blood type does not determine intelligence, spiritual significance, or human worth. The distribution of Rh-negative blood follows population genetics, migration history, and inheritance patterns rather than secret dynastic design. Still, the psychological attraction remains understandable. Human beings are storytelling creatures. We search for meaning in unusual patterns. A rare trait feels more emotionally satisfying when connected to destiny instead of random inheritance. Ancient royal culture reinforced that tendency for thousands of years. Even today, people often speak metaphorically about good blood, strong bloodlines, or noble ancestry, without realizing how deeply those ideas reach into the past. Ironically, modern genetics paints a far more interconnected picture of humanity than ancient aristocracies ever imagined. Most populations have mixed repeatedly across history. Migration, trade, war, and ordinary relationships constantly reshaped human ancestry. Even isolated groups rarely remained fully separate forever. The notion of completely pure bloodlines surviving unchanged across millennia belongs more to mythology than science. What survives instead are shifting patterns of inheritance shaped by geography, chance, and human movement. Rh-negative blood fits into that broader reality. It may preserve traces of ancient isolation or migration, but not evidence of chosen families standing outside ordinary humanity. Yet perhaps the persistence of these myths reveals something important about the human mind itself. Across civilizations, people repeatedly transformed biological inheritance into stories about identity and destiny. Ancient rulers used bloodline myths to justify power. Later, societies attached mystery to rare genetic traits. In both cases, the underlying desire remained similar. People wanted ancestry to explain who belonged, who mattered, and where human difference originated. Modern science complicates those comforting narratives. It reveals a species connected through endless mixing and migration rather than neatly separated bloodlines. But even in the age of genetics, the old emotional power of blood has never completely disappeared. Across nearly every civilization in history, human beings created stories about sacred ancestry. Some traced their rulers back to the gods. Others believed certain families carried divine favor through blood itself. In ancient Mesopotamia, kings claimed heavenly authority. Egyptian pharaohs were treated as living bridges between the human and divine worlds. In parts of Asia, royal dynasties described themselves as descendants of celestial beings or sacred founders. Medieval Europe developed elaborate genealogies connecting noble houses to legendary heroes and biblical lineages. Even small tribal societies often preserved oral traditions about ancestral blood carrying special meaning or responsibility. These beliefs emerged long before genetics existed, yet they reflected a universal psychological pattern. People wanted ancestry to explain identity, hierarchy, and destiny. Blood became the perfect symbol for this idea because it felt permanent and invisible at the same time. Wealth can disappear, kingdoms can collapse, but blood passes quietly from one generation into the next. Ancient societies understood inheritance emotionally long before they understood it biologically. Children inherited physical resemblance, social position, family memory, and sometimes disease. Entire personalities seemed to echo through family lines. Without modern science, it was easy to imagine that blood itself carried moral or spiritual essence. Once this belief became embedded within a culture, rare or unusual traits naturally attracted fascination. Human psychology often assigns deeper meaning to rarity. A strange birthmark, an uncommon appearance, or an inherited condition could become evidence of divine ancestry, sacred favor, or hidden destiny, depending on the culture. Negative blood entered modern imagination through this same ancient mental pattern, even though the scientific context was entirely different. Once people learned that some blood types were relatively uncommon, speculation followed almost automatically. The less understood a trait appeared, the easier it became to surround it with myth. In reality, science treats Rh-negative blood as one inherited variation among many within the human species. Yet emotionally, rare blood still feels mysterious to many people because ancient instincts about lineage remain deeply rooted in human thought. This tendency becomes especially powerful during periods of uncertainty. Throughout history, societies facing rapid change often turn toward ancestry myths for stability and meaning. Noble families emphasize sacred bloodlines during political instability. Nations created origin myths during periods of expansion or crisis. Even modern individuals sometimes search ancestry tests, hoping to discover hidden identity or ancient connection. Blood and DNA feel personal in ways historical documents do not. They suggest that history is not merely something that happened long ago, but something physically carried inside the body itself. Rh-negative blood fascinates many people precisely because it seems to sit at the border between science and ancient symbolism. Modern laboratories can identify it objectively, yet its uneven distribution still leaves room for imagination. The internet intensified this fascination dramatically. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, online communities began building elaborate theories around Rh-negative ancestry. Some claimed connections to Atlantis, ancient aliens, or secret ruling bloodlines. Others described Rh-negative individuals as spiritually different or biologically unique. These theories spread widely because they offered emotionally satisfying narratives about identity and mystery. But mainstream genetics does not support such conclusions. Human variation is real, but it exists within one interconnected species shaped by migration and mixing over immense periods of time. What makes these myths interesting is not whether they are scientifically true, but why human beings repeatedly create them. Perhaps people struggle to accept randomness in inheritance. A rare blood type feels more meaningful when attached to hidden history rather than ordinary genetics. Ancient societies transformed lineage into mythology for similar reasons. Stories about sacred blood gave structure to uncertainty. They explained why rulers ruled, why families mattered, and why certain groups seemed different from others. Modern science removed many supernatural explanations, yet it did not erase the emotional power of ancestry itself. If anything, genetics made ancestry feel even more intimate by revealing how deeply the past survives inside living bodies. And among all the populations connected to Rh-negative discussions, one group continued attracting particular fascination from scientists and storytellers alike. In the mountains between Spain and France lived a people whose language, history, and blood patterns seemed to preserve unusually ancient traces of Europe's distant past. The Basques became one of the most discussed examples of how isolation, ancestry, and mystery can converge inside a single human population. Along the western edge of the Pyrenees Mountains, between northern Spain and southwestern France, lives one of Europe's most unusual cultural populations. The Basque people have occupied this region for thousands of years, maintaining traditions and language patterns that puzzled historians long before modern genetics existed. Their homeland is marked by rugged hills, coastal villages, green valleys, and mountain passes that once limited easy movement from surrounding regions. Geography helped preserve aspects of Basque identity across centuries of political change. Empires rose and fell around them. Romans entered the Iberian Peninsula. Medieval kingdoms expanded. Modern nation-states eventually formed, yet the Basques retained a distinct cultural presence that survived through all of it. What fascinated researchers most was not only their history, but their language. Euskara, the Basque language, stands apart from nearly every other major language in Europe. Most European languages belong to the Indo-European family, connected through distant linguistic ancestry stretching back thousands of years. Euskara does not clearly fit into that system. Linguists have debated its origins for generations. Some researchers believe it may preserve fragments of a language spoken in Western Europe before Indo-European languages spread across the continent. No consensus fully explains its origins, but its uniqueness alone attracted enormous scholarly attention. To many historians and anthropologists, the Basques appeared to preserve echoes of very ancient Europe. During the 20th century, blood research added another layer to that fascination. Scientists studying blood group frequencies discovered that Rh-negative blood appeared among Basque populations at unusually high rates compared to many neighbouring groups. Exact percentages varied across regions and studies, but the pattern remained notable enough to become widely discussed in genetics research. Combined with the distinctiveness of the Basque language and long periods of relative geographic isolation, the blood data encouraged speculation about ancient ancestry. Some researchers proposed that Basque populations might preserve stronger genetic continuity with prehistoric inhabitants of Western Europe than many surrounding populations. Importantly, modern genetics does not describe the Basques as a separate race or mysterious lost civilization. DNA studies consistently show that Basque people are fully part of the broader European genetic landscape. They share ancestry with neighbouring populations while also preserving signs of historical isolation. Their distinctiveness appears to result from long periods of relative continuity and reduced outside mixing compared to some surrounding regions. This is scientifically fascinating, but very different from the exaggerated myths often attached to the Basques in popular culture. Isolation and continuity can preserve unusual genetic frequencies without requiring supernatural explanations. Still, the Basque example became deeply connected to public discussions about Rh-negative blood because it seemed to unite several mysteries at once: an ancient language, a geographically protected population, unusual blood frequencies, hints of prehistoric continuity surviving into the modern world. For storytellers and internet theorists, these elements form the perfect environment for speculation. Yet the real scientific significance of the Basques may be even more interesting than the myths themselves. They remind researchers how much ancient population structure can survive quietly through time. Human history did not erase all traces of the distant past. In certain regions, cultural and genetic continuity remained surprisingly resilient, despite centuries of migration and political transformation. The Basques became one example of how older layers of European ancestry might still be visible within modern populations. Rh-negative blood played only one part in that larger story, but it became one of the most emotionally charged elements because blood already carried such symbolic weight in human imagination. Perhaps what draws people toward the Basque mystery is not the promise of hidden supernatural origins, but something quieter and more human. In a rapidly changing world, the idea that a population could preserve traces of ancient ancestry across thousands of years feels strangely comforting. It suggests continuity beneath historical chaos, a connection between modern people and forgotten prehistoric lives. The Basques did not preserve magical secrets inside their blood, but through language, geography, ancestry, and isolation, they became living evidence that fragments of humanity's distant past can survive far longer than most civilizations ever imagined. The landscape surrounding the Basque homeland shaped far more than scenery. Mountains have always influenced human history in quiet but powerful ways. They slow migration, complicate communication, and protect isolated communities from outside control. For thousands of years, the Western Pyrenees created a natural barrier between regions of Europe. People still crossed them, traded through them, and fought across them, but movement remained slower and more selective than on open plains. In ancient times, even modest geographic obstacles could preserve cultural differences across surprisingly short distances. A mountain valley only a few days away might develop its own traditions, speech patterns, and family networks over generations. The Basque region benefited from exactly this kind of partial isolation. Historians believe that the Basques maintained continuity not because they were completely separated from the outside world, but because geography slowed the pace of cultural and genetic mixing enough for older patterns to survive longer. Euskara reflects this continuity in remarkable ways. Unlike most European languages, it has no universally accepted close linguistic relative. Scholars spent centuries trying to classify it within broader language families, yet it continued resisting simple explanation. Modern linguists generally agree that Euskara likely represents a surviving remnant of pre-Indo-European languages, once spoken in parts of Western Europe before later migration waves transformed the continent linguistically. If true, the language itself may preserve echoes of communities that existed before many familiar European cultures emerged. This possibility fascinated not only linguists, but also historians, archaeologists, and genetic researchers searching for signs of ancient continuity within modern populations. Language alone does not determine genetics, of course. Populations can adopt new languages without major biological change, and genetically similar groups can speak completely different languages. Yet when unusual linguistic continuity appears alongside signs of relative geographic isolation and distinctive genetic frequencies, researchers naturally pay closer attention. The Basque region became one of the clearest examples of how culture, geography, and ancestry can interact across immense stretches of time. Rh-negative blood entered this discussion because its frequency among Basque populations seemed to fit the broader pattern of preserved historical distinctiveness. Scientists studying population genetics sometimes describe isolated communities as genetic time capsules. This phrase can sound dramatic, but the underlying idea is straightforward. When populations experience lower levels of outside mixing over long periods, they may preserve older genetic patterns more clearly than highly connected regions. These preserved patterns help researchers reconstruct aspects of ancient population history that written records alone cannot explain. The Basques are not frozen relics from prehistory. They changed, adapted, and mixed with surrounding populations across centuries like every human community. But relative isolation allowed certain older features, both cultural and genetic, to remain unusually visible. Similar processes occurred elsewhere throughout the world. Island populations often preserve distinctive genetic traits. Remote mountain communities sometimes maintain ancient dialects, or inherited characteristics long after neighbouring regions changed dramatically. Geography acts almost like a filter through time, slowing the constant blending process that usually reshapes human populations. Rh negative blood likely became more concentrated in some isolated regions through this gradual preservation rather than through sudden mysterious origins. Modern genetic studies support a nuanced view of Basque ancestry. Earlier theories once imagined the Basques as direct, untouched descendants of Europe's earliest hunter-gatherers. Current research paints a more complex picture. Basque populations share ancestry with neighbouring Iberian groups, while also preserving evidence of long-term relative continuity and somewhat lower outside admixture during certain historical periods. In other words, the Basques are neither completely isolated nor completely typical. They occupy an important middle ground that helps scientists study how ancient population structure can survive partially into the modern age. Perhaps this is why the Basque mystery continues attracting attention even outside academic circles. It touches a deep human curiosity about continuity through time. In a world where cultures change rapidly and historical memory often feels fragile, the existence of a population preserving traces of ancient language and ancestry feels almost improbable. Rh negative blood became emotionally tied to that story because blood itself symbolizes inheritance so strongly across human cultures. Yet the real lesson may be less mystical and more profound. Human history is not fully erased by time. Sometimes it survives quietly in accents, traditions, genes, and even small biological variations carried invisibly through generations beneath the surface of ordinary life. As the internet expanded during the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the Basque population gradually moved beyond academic discussion and into popular mythology. Information that once remained mostly inside universities, medical journals, and anthropology research became accessible to millions of people searching for explanations about ancestry and identity. At first, much of the public curiosity surrounding the Basques was harmless fascination. People were intrigued by an ancient language surviving inside modern Europe, by unusual blood type frequencies, and by the possibility that fragments of prehistoric ancestry still persisted within living populations. But over time, the gaps between scientific certainty and public imagination began filling with speculation. Rh negative blood became one of the central ingredients in that transformation. Online articles, documentaries, and discussion forums started presenting the Basques as evidence of hidden historical narratives. Some theories claimed the Basques descended directly from Atlantis. Others connected them to biblical lineages, vanished Ice Age civilizations, or extraterrestrial visitors. Rh negative blood was often described as proof that these populations were fundamentally different from the rest of humanity. Many of these claims repeated each other across websites without scientific sourcing, slowly creating an illusion of credibility through repetition alone. Yet mainstream genetics never supported these conclusions. Researchers studying Basque ancestry consistently described a much more grounded reality. Long-term regional continuity combined with relative isolation, not supernatural origin. The internet accelerated a very old human tendency. Whenever history contains uncertainty, stories emerge to fill the empty spaces. Ancient societies created myths around unusual bloodlines through religion and oral tradition. Modern societies often create them through fragmented scientific information mixed with emotional storytelling. Rh negative blood became especially vulnerable to this process because it sounds both scientific and mysterious at the same time. Most people understand blood as deeply personal, yet few fully understand genetics. This creates fertile ground for misunderstanding. A real biological trait becomes surrounded by symbolic meaning far beyond the evidence itself. The Basque case illustrates how easily science and mythology can blend together in public imagination. Real facts existed underneath the fascination. The Basque language truly is unusual. Relative isolation did shape aspects of Basque ancestry. Rh negative blood does appear at somewhat elevated frequencies in parts of the population, but each true detail became exaggerated once separated from scientific context. Isolation transformed into hidden civilization. Genetic continuity became pure ancient blood. Statistical differences became proof of non-human origin. Step by step, complexity disappeared, and myth replaced nuance. Scientists often struggle against this process because real research tends to sound cautious and incomplete. Researchers speak in probabilities, population models, and evolving evidence. Myths offer certainty, emotional excitement, and simple answers. Yet the scientific perspective may ultimately be more awe-inspiring than the fictional versions. Modern genetics reveals that all human populations contain deep layers of ancient ancestry, shaped by migration, adaptation, and isolation across immense stretches of time. The Basques are not uniquely mysterious because they possess magical blood. They are fascinating because they demonstrate how fragments of very old human history can survive quietly inside modern populations. This difference matters. Pseudoscientific myths about bloodlines have historically caused enormous harm. Ideas about superior ancestry or special blood contributed to racism, nationalism, and exclusion throughout history. 20th century Europe demonstrated how dangerous biological myths can become when mixed with politics and identity. That history makes scientific caution especially important when discussing inherited traits like Rh-negative blood. Curiosity about ancestry is natural. Turning ancestry into mythology about human superiority is something very different. Perhaps the enduring fascination surrounding Rh-negative blood reveals less about hidden civilizations and more about the human need for connection to the distant past. Modern life often feels detached from ancient history. Genetic ancestry offers a rare sense of continuity across time. People want to believe that something inside them still reaches back toward forgotten worlds. In that emotional sense, the myths surrounding Rh-negative blood become understandable, even when they are scientifically unsupported. They reflect a longing to feel part of a deeper human story. Yet the real story already exists without invention. Human populations truly did survive ice ages, migrations, isolation, and cultural transformation across tens of thousands of years. Ancient ancestry genuinely survives inside living people today. The mystery is real. It simply belongs to history and biology rather than fantasy. By the late 20th century, Rh-negative blood had begun drifting far away from hospital laboratories and population genetics research into a very different world. Books about hidden history, late-night radio programs, early internet forums, and speculative documentaries slowly transformed a medical trait into a cultural mystery. The process happened gradually. At first, writers simply emphasized how unusual the blood type seemed. Then came larger claims. Some suggested Rh-negative individuals descended from lost ancient civilizations. Others proposed forgotten hybrid populations, secret royal bloodlines, or visitors from beyond Earth itself. Over time, these ideas spread widely online, repeated so often that many people encountered them before ever reading actual scientific explanations about the Rh factor. The most famous theories connected Rh-negative blood to ancient alien narratives. According to these claims, the absence of the Rh factor supposedly indicated ancestry separate from ordinary humanity. Supporters pointed to the reproductive complications associated with Rh incompatibility and argued that this represented evidence of two biologically different groups mixing together. Some even claimed Rh-negative blood proved extraterrestrial intervention in human evolution. Scientifically, none of these conclusions are supported by evidence. Reproductive incompatibilities occur throughout nature and do not imply non-human ancestry. Genetic research overwhelmingly confirms that Rh-negative individuals are fully human members of the same species as everyone else. Yet despite this, the theories continued spreading because they satisfied emotional and psychological needs deeper than scientific accuracy alone. Human beings are uncomfortable with unanswered questions. When science leaves uncertainty around ancient origins, inheritance, or unusual biological patterns, many people instinctively search for narratives that feel complete. A mystery with no answer creates tension inside the mind. Conspiracy theories reduce that tension by offering certainty, even when the explanation itself lacks evidence. Rh-negative blood became especially attractive for this kind of speculation, because it already contained several ingredients that trigger fascination naturally: rarity, uneven geographic distribution, reproductive implications, and ancient ancestry patterns. Each element felt mysterious enough on its own. Combined together, they created the perfect environment for mythology. There is also another psychological layer beneath these theories. Many people want to feel different in ways that carry meaning. Modern life can feel anonymous and disconnected. The idea of possessing hidden ancestry or unusual biological significance offers a sense of identity that ordinary existence sometimes lacks. Throughout history, humans repeatedly transformed inherited differences into stories about destiny or special origin. Ancient aristocracies claimed divine bloodlines. Religious traditions describe chosen lineages. Modern conspiracy culture often reuses the same emotional structure, while replacing gods with aliens, secret civilizations, or hidden genetic programs. The details change across centuries, but the underlying human impulse remains remarkably similar. Negative blood became a modern canvas for very old storytelling instincts. The internet intensified these patterns dramatically because digital information spreads without the careful filtering that exists within scientific research. A speculative theory written convincingly online can travel across millions of screens regardless of whether evidence supports it. Once repeated often enough, emotional familiarity begins replacing verification. This is especially true for subjects involving genetics, where the science itself can feel difficult or inaccessible to non-specialists. Complex population history becomes simplified into dramatic narratives about hidden truth. Scientific caution sounds weak compared to absolute certainty, even when caution is more accurate. Researchers studying human ancestry rarely speak in definitive absolutes, because evidence continues evolving. Conspiracy theories, by contrast, often present themselves with complete confidence, yet the real scientific story surrounding Rh-negative blood remains extraordinary even without mythology. Human genetics already reveals a species shaped by ancient migration, survival, isolation, and adaptation over immense stretches of time. Rare traits can persist naturally through inheritance and population dynamics. Ancient ancestry truly survives inside modern bodies. None of this requires extraterrestrial intervention to become meaningful or fascinating. In some ways, the popularity of Rh-negative myths reveals an unexpected tension between science and imagination. Modern genetics gave humanity deeper insight into ancestry than any civilization before it. At the same time, those discoveries awakened emotional questions science cannot fully answer. People do not only want data about where humans came from, they want stories that explain what human difference means. And whenever science leaves uncertainty at the edges of understanding, mythology quietly waits nearby, ready to turn mystery into belief. The internet changed the way mysteries spread through human society. In earlier centuries, myths traveled slowly through books, rumors, religious traditions, or local storytelling. Modern digital culture accelerated that process beyond anything previous civilizations experienced. A speculative idea posted online could circle the world in hours, repeated across videos, forums, articles, and social media feeds before experts even noticed it. Rh-negative blood entered this new environment at exactly the right moment. It combined science, ancestry, rarity, and uncertainty into a subject perfectly designed for viral fascination. Algorithms rewarded emotional engagement, and mystery creates engagement more effectively than careful explanation. Quiet scientific nuance rarely competes well against dramatic hidden origin stories. Part of the problem lies in how human attention works. Scientific research usually progresses slowly. Researchers test hypotheses, revise conclusions, acknowledge uncertainty, and often disagree with one another. Real science sounds cautious because evidence changes over time. Pseudoscientific narratives operate differently. They offer confidence, emotional certainty, and simple explanations for complicated questions. Instead of saying this trait likely emerged through multiple ancient population processes that remain partly uncertain, conspiracy theories say this bloodline came from hidden beings. The second statement feels more emotionally satisfying even when it lacks evidence. Human brains are naturally drawn towards stories with clear meaning and dramatic structure. Rh-negative blood became internet folklore, partly because the real scientific explanation requires patience with complexity. Online media also tends to blur the boundary between possibility and proof. A question can quietly transform into a claim through repetition alone. Someone asks whether isolated populations preserved ancient genetic traits. Another person rephrases it as evidence of lost civilizations. Eventually, audiences encounter only the final exaggerated version repeated across hundreds of sources. Over time, speculation begins feeling familiar enough to seem true. This process is not unique to Rh-negative blood. Similar patterns appear around ancient monuments, archaeology, astronomy, and nearly every scientific topic connected to human origins. But blood carries unusual emotional power because it feels personal. A person's blood type belongs inside their own body. That intimacy makes speculation feel more immediate and meaningful. Fear also plays a role in how these myths spread. Medical topics naturally create anxiety because they involve survival, reproduction, and identity. Rh incompatibility, for example, is a real biological condition that historically caused serious pregnancy complications before modern treatment became available. Conspiracy narratives often build around small pieces of genuine science, then extend far beyond what the evidence supports. The existence of a real medical phenomenon makes surrounding speculation appear more believable to non-specialists. This blending of truth and exaggeration is one reason pseudoscience spreads so effectively online. It rarely invents everything completely. Instead, it wraps unsupported conclusions around fragments of real information. Over time, Rh-negative blood evolved into something resembling modern folklore. Traditional folklore explained natural mysteries through symbolic stories passed between generations. Digital folklore operates similarly, except the stories travel through algorithms instead of campfires. Online communities repeat narratives about hidden ancestry, unusual abilities, or ancient origins because those stories satisfy emotional needs. They create identity, belonging, and mystery inside a world that often feels fragmented and uncertain. People sharing these theories are not always irrational or dishonest. Many are responding to a genuine sense of wonder about human history and biology. The problem begins when emotional storytelling replaces evidence entirely. Modern genetics already reveals a human past far stranger and more interconnected than earlier civilizations imagined. Ancient populations migrated across continents during ice ages. Entire groups disappeared while leaving traces inside future generations. DNA preserves echoes of forgotten worlds beneath modern society. None of this is fictional. Yet real science often feels emotionally incomplete because it rarely offers final answers. There is no single moment where researchers discovered the ultimate origin of Rh-negative blood. No hidden archive explains every ancient migration perfectly. Human history remains partially unresolved, and perhaps it always will. That unresolved quality can feel uncomfortable. Mythology steps into that discomfort by promising certainty where science offers only probability. But certainty is not the same thing as truth. In many ways, the ongoing fascination with Rh-negative blood reveals how difficult it is for human beings to live peacefully beside unanswered questions. We are drawn instinctively towards stories that close the gaps in understanding, even when the gaps themselves may contain the most honest reflection of reality. Human beings have always struggled with incomplete stories. Across cultures and centuries, whenever people encountered something difficult to explain, they instinctively created narratives to close the uncertainty. Ancient civilizations watched storms and imagined gods controlling the sky. Unexplained illness became curses or spiritual imbalance. Strange lights in the heavens inspired myths about divine messages. The pattern repeated constantly because the human mind dislikes empty spaces in understanding. Uncertainty feels unstable. A story, even an imperfect one, creates emotional order. Rh-negative blood entered this ancient psychological pattern in a modern scientific age. The details changed, but the impulse remained the same. A rare inherited trait with uneven global distribution and partially unresolved historical origins became fertile ground for mythology. Modern science explains much about the Rh factor, yet it does not answer every question with absolute certainty. That remaining ambiguity attracts imagination almost automatically. Psychologists sometimes describe human beings as natural pattern seekers. The brain constantly searches for meaning, relationships, and explanations, even when information remains incomplete. This ability helped ancient humans survive, recognizing patterns in weather, animal behavior, or social relationships improved chances of survival long before formal science existed. But the same tendency also makes people vulnerable to false conclusions. When evidence is limited, the brain often connects unrelated details into emotionally satisfying narratives. Rh-negative blood illustrates this process clearly. People notice that the trait is relatively rare. They learn that some isolated populations show higher frequencies. They hear about pregnancy complications linked to Rh incompatibility. Suddenly, separate facts begin feeling connected to a larger hidden story, even when no evidence supports such a conclusion. The mystery itself becomes emotionally powerful because it feels unresolved. There is also a deeper existential layer beneath these myths. Questions about ancestry are never purely scientific. They touch identity, belonging, and mortality. Human beings want to know where they came from because origin stories help define meaning. Ancient cultures answered these questions through religion and mythology. Modern genetics introduced new forms of ancestry knowledge, but it did not eliminate the emotional hunger behind the questions themselves. In some ways, DNA research intensified that hunger by revealing how much ancient history still survives invisibly inside living people. The body became evidence that the distant past never fully disappeared. Rh negative blood gained symbolic importance, partly because it seemed to offer access to hidden ancestry that ordinary history could not fully explain. Yet perhaps the most difficult lesson of modern science is that not every mystery ends with a dramatic revelation. Sometimes the truth remains fragmented, statistical, and incomplete. Evolution does not produce neat narratives designed for human satisfaction. Genetic variation emerges through mutation, inheritance, migration, isolation, and chance across enormous spans of time. Researchers studying Rh negative blood can explain many aspects of its biology and distribution with reasonable confidence, but ancient population history itself remains extraordinarily complex. New discoveries continue changing older assumptions. The absence of a final perfect answer does not mean science has failed. It simply reflects the immense complexity of human origins. Mythology often becomes strongest precisely where science remains cautious. A scientist saying, "We do not fully know yet," leaves emotional space open. Conspiracy theories rush to fill that space with certainty. But certainty achieved without evidence can become dangerous. Throughout history, myths about blood and ancestry fueled division, superiority narratives, and fear of outsiders. The 20th century showed how destructive pseudoscientific ideas about human difference could become when combined with politics and identity. That history matters because modern fascination with bloodline myths sometimes repeats older emotional patterns in new forms. The real scientific story surrounding Rh negative blood is already extraordinary enough without invention. Human populations crossed continents during ice ages, survived isolation, mixed repeatedly, and carried ancient genetic traces forward through thousands of years of history. Some inherited variations persisted simply because ancient geography and population structure allowed them to survive. Hidden within modern blood systems are echoes of migrations and communities long forgotten by written history. That reality may lack the dramatic simplicity of mythology, but it offers something quieter and perhaps more meaningful, a reminder that humanity itself is ancient, interconnected, and still only partially understood. And after centuries of speculation, storytelling, and conspiracy, scientists eventually return to the most important question of all. What does modern genetics actually know about Rh negative blood? And where do the limits of that knowledge truly begin? After decades of speculation, mythology, and internet theories, modern genetics approaches Rh negative blood in a far more grounded way. Scientists do not view the Rh factor as evidence of hidden species or supernatural ancestry. Instead, they study it as one part of normal human genetic variation shaped by mutation, inheritance, and population history over long periods of time. The scientific explanation may sound less dramatic than conspiracy theories, but it reveals something equally fascinating. The human body preserves traces of ancient biological processes that unfolded across thousands of generations. At the center of the Rh system lies the RHD gene. This gene helps produce the D antigen, a protein located on the surface of red blood cells. If a person carries a functioning version of the gene, the D antigen appears and the person is classified as Rh positive. If the gene is missing, altered, or inactive in certain ways, the D antigen does not appear, resulting in Rh negative blood. In simple terms, Rh negative individuals lack a particular protein on their red blood cells. Nothing about this makes them non-human or biologically separate from the rest of humanity. It is simply one inherited variation among many within the species. Genetics constantly produces variation through mutation. Most mutations are neutral or insignificant. Some disappear quickly. Others survive and spread through populations depending on inheritance patterns, geography, chance, and environmental pressures. Scientists believe the Rh-negative trait emerged through ancient genetic mutations affecting the Rhd gene long before recorded history. Because these mutations occurred in prehistoric populations, no written record exists describing when or where they first appeared. Researchers instead reconstruct the story indirectly through population genetics and statistical analysis. Modern science can explain inheritance patterns with considerable confidence. Rh-positive inheritance is generally dominant, while Rh-negative inheritance usually requires altered versions of the gene from both parents. This helps explain why Rh-negative blood remains less common globally. Yet, inheritance alone does not determine how frequent a trait becomes within populations. Migration, isolation, founder effects, and genetic drift all influence distribution over time. The elevated frequency of Rh-negative blood in parts of Europe likely reflects combinations of these long-term historical processes rather than any single dramatic event. Scientists are also careful about what they do not know completely. Evolutionary biology rarely offers perfectly tidy explanations for every genetic trait. Some researchers have explored whether Rh-negative blood might once have provided subtle advantages under certain ancient environmental conditions, though no universally accepted answer exists. Others emphasize that many inherited traits survive simply because they are not harmful enough to disappear through natural selection. Before modern medicine, Rh incompatibility could create serious reproductive risks, but not necessarily severe enough to eliminate the trait entirely from populations. Evolution operates through probabilities across huge spans of time, not through perfect optimization. This uncertainty is important because science functions differently from mythology. Scientific knowledge remains open to revision when new evidence appears. Researchers test hypotheses against data rather than protecting emotionally satisfying narratives. Ancient DNA analysis, for example, continues reshaping our understanding of prehistoric migration almost every decade. Earlier assumptions about isolated populations or simple ancestry patterns often become more complicated as new genetic evidence emerges. The story of Rh-negative blood exists inside that larger evolving picture of human population history. One of the clearest conclusions from modern genetics is that humanity is deeply interconnected. All modern humans belong to the same species and share overwhelmingly similar DNA. The differences between populations are relatively small compared to the enormous amount of genetic overlap uniting humanity. Rh-negative blood does not divide humans into separate origins. Instead, it reflects the ordinary complexity of inherited variation shaped by ancient migration and isolation patterns. In some ways, the scientific reality surrounding Rh-negative blood is more humbling than the myths. There is no secret hidden above humanity, no chosen bloodline standing outside history. What exists instead is a species carrying the biological memory of countless ancient journeys inside every generation. Modern genetics reveals that the past survives not as legend, but as inheritance quietly moving through time beneath the surface of ordinary life. One of the most common questions surrounding Rh-negative blood is surprisingly simple. If the trait can create reproductive complications under certain conditions, why did evolution not eliminate it long ago? The answer reveals something important about how evolution actually works. Popular culture often imagines evolution as a perfect system, constantly removing anything unusual or imperfect from a species. Real biology is far less precise. Evolution does not aim toward perfection. It operates through probabilities, environmental pressures, inheritance, and chance across enormous spans of time. Many traits survive not because they are ideal, but because they are neutral enough, situationally useful, or simply never harmful enough to disappear completely. Rh-negative blood appears to fit within that reality. Before modern medicine, Rh incompatibility sometimes created serious risks during pregnancy. If an Rh-negative mother carried an Rh-positive child, her immune system could develop antibodies against Rh-positive blood cells after exposure. In later pregnancies, those antibodies could potentially attack the blood cells of another Rh-positive fetus, leading to hemolytic disease of the newborn. Historically, this complication caused suffering and infant mortality in some cases. Yet even before medical treatment existed, the condition did not affect every pregnancy. Many Rh-negative individuals reproduce successfully across generations. The trait therefore remained present within populations, rather than being removed entirely through natural selection. Scientists also point out that evolutionary pressure depends heavily on context. A genetic trait harmful in one environment may be neutral or even slightly advantageous in another. Researchers have explored whether Rh-negative blood could once have carried subtle biological benefits under certain ancient conditions, though no single explanation has gained universal acceptance. Some studies investigated possible links involving resistance to particular infections or environmental adaptations, but the evidence remains incomplete and often debated. Importantly, science does not require every surviving trait to possess a major hidden advantage. Many inherited variations persist simply because human populations are large, mobile, and genetically diverse. Chance plays a greater role in evolution than many people realize. Genetic drift helps explain part of this survival. In smaller or partially isolated populations, unusual traits can remain common for long periods even without providing strong advantages. Ancient human communities often lived in relatively small groups compared to modern societies. During Ice Age periods or geographic isolation, populations could remain separated for centuries or longer. Under those conditions, inherited traits like Rh-negative blood could persist naturally through ordinary reproduction patterns. Evolution is not constantly examining each trait individually and removing it with precision. It works slowly, imperfectly, and often unpredictably across generations. Modern genetics also reveals that human evolution never followed a straight path. Populations repeatedly separated and reconnected throughout prehistory. Migration carried inherited variations across continents. Isolation concentrated some traits while mixing diluted others. The Rh factor became part of this larger human story rather than existing outside it. Researchers studying ancient DNA increasingly describe humanity as a network of overlapping ancestries rather than isolated biological categories. Rh-negative blood survives within that interconnected system as one variation among many shaped by ancient demographic history. At the same time, science still acknowledges genuine uncertainty. Researchers understand the mechanics of Rh inheritance and the biology of the Rhd gene with strong confidence. They can map population frequencies and model ancient migration patterns statistically. But no scientist can identify the exact moment the Rh-negative mutation first appeared or fully reconstruct every historical factor, influencing its spread. Human prehistory extends far beyond written records. Much evidence vanished thousands of years ago. Genetics can recover fragments of that history, but not complete certainty. This distinction matters because uncertainty is often misunderstood publicly. In science, unanswered questions are normal. They do not automatically imply hidden conspiracies or suppressed truths. Human origins are simply extraordinarily complicated. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Rh-negative blood is not that it survived, but that modern science can trace any part of its story at all. Hidden inside a tiny molecular variation is evidence of migrations, isolation, reproduction, and survival stretching across prehistoric time. The trait persisted because ancient human populations persisted. Generation after generation carried it forward without understanding the biological mechanisms involved. Long before laboratories existed, evolution was already writing quiet records inside human blood. Records that modern genetics is only beginning to read with clarity. After more than a century of research, modern science can now answer many questions about Rh-negative blood with considerable confidence. Researchers understand the biological mechanism behind the Rh factor. They know how the Rhd gene influences the presence or absence of the D antigen on red blood cells. They understand how inheritance patterns pass Rouge status from parents to children. Medicine has also learned how to prevent most serious complications associated with Rh incompatibility during pregnancy, through careful screening and treatment. What once caused fear and confusion inside hospitals is now largely manageable in much of the world because of advances in immunology and prenatal care. In these areas, the mystery surrounding Rh-negative blood has been replaced by detailed scientific understanding. Population genetics has also revealed important parts of the historical picture. Scientists know that Rh-negative frequencies vary significantly across human populations. The trait appears relatively uncommon in much of Asia and Africa, while occurring more frequently in parts of Europe, especially Western Europe. Researchers understand that ancient migration, genetic drift, founder effects, and partial geographic isolation all likely contributed to these patterns over thousands of years. Ancient DNA studies continue refining this picture by uncovering new information about prehistoric human movement and ancestry. Each year, scientists reconstruct more of humanity's deep genetic past using techniques unimaginable only decades ago. Yet despite all this progress, some questions remain open. Researchers still cannot identify the exact prehistoric moment when the Rh-negative mutation first emerged. The earliest carriers lived long before written records existed. Scientists also continue debating the precise combination of evolutionary and demographic factors that shaped the trait's uneven distribution across populations. Some uncertainties may eventually become clearer as ancient DNA databases expand. Others may remain permanently incomplete because too much evidence vanished across prehistoric time. This balance between knowledge and uncertainty is normal within science. The goal of research is not to create perfect certainty about every question, but to build increasingly accurate explanations supported by evidence. One of the most important lessons modern genetics teaches is humility. Earlier generations often imagined human populations as sharply separated categories with fixed origins. Contemporary research reveals something far more fluid and interconnected. Human history consists of continuous migration, mixing, isolation, adaptation, and reconnection unfolding across tens of thousands of years. No population exists outside that larger story. Rh-negative blood does not point toward a hidden species or secret civilization. It reflects the ordinary complexity of human inheritance shaped by ancient demographic history. Yet calling this process ordinary does not make it any less astonishing. Inside every human body survives a biological archive stretching backward through uncounted generations. DNA preserves traces of people whose names, languages, and cultures disappeared thousands of years ago. Blood systems carry evidence of migrations that occurred before the invention of writing itself. Modern science has revealed that the past is not truly gone. Fragments of it continue moving silently through living populations every day. In some ways, this scientific reality replaces mythology with something quieter but more profound. Ancient civilizations imagined blood as sacred because they sensed it carried continuity between generations. Modern genetics confirmed that intuition in biological form, blood does connect the present to the distant past, though not through magical destiny or supernatural ancestry. Instead, it carries the accumulated inheritance of countless human lives shaped by survival, geography, and time. Rh-negative blood became mysterious, partly because it reminded people how much hidden history still exists inside ordinary biology. The future of genetics research will likely deepen this understanding even further. As sequencing technology improves and ancient DNA samples increase, scientists may uncover new details about prehistoric population structure and migration. The map of human ancestry continues changing with each discovery, but perhaps the most meaningful conclusion has already emerged. Human beings are not isolated from history, we are made from it. Every inherited trait represents the survival of ancient lives reaching quietly into the present. Rh-negative blood is one small thread inside that immense human tapestry, a reminder that the story of humanity is still unfolding beneath the surface of modern life, carried invisibly through generations that rarely stop to notice how ancient they truly are. For most people, blood feels ordinary because it is always present. It moves silently through the body every second of life without demanding attention. Yet modern science gradually revealed that blood contains far more than oxygen and nutrients. Hidden within blood systems are traces of ancestry, migration, adaptation, and survival stretching backward across thousands of years. In this sense, blood functions almost like a living historical archive. It carries biological information from ancient populations into the modern world, preserving fragments of human history long after languages, monuments, and civilizations disappear. Rh-negative blood became fascinating, partly because it reminded researchers how much of the human past still survives invisibly inside ordinary bodies. Long before genetics existed, historians relied mostly on artifacts, ruins, and written records to reconstruct ancient societies. but written history covers only a tiny fraction of humanity's existence. Modern humans lived for tens of thousands of years before the first civilizations began recording events. Most ancient people left no documents behind. Entire populations vanished without preserving their names. For centuries, large sections of prehistoric human history remained almost completely invisible. Genetics changed that. Scientists eventually realized that DNA preserved information capable of revealing relationships between populations separated by immense distances and time periods. The body itself became evidence. Blood groups were among the earliest biological markers researchers used to study these hidden patterns. Before full genome sequencing became available, scientists compared blood type frequencies across populations to estimate historical relationships and migration patterns. These methods had limitations, but they revealed an important truth. Inherited biological traits could preserve clues about ancient human movement. Rh negative blood entered this research as one small piece of a much larger puzzle involving ancestry and population history. Today, genetic technology has advanced far beyond early blood studies. Researchers can extract DNA from ancient skeletons thousands of years old and compare it directly to modern populations. Through this process, scientists discovered that human history was shaped by repeated waves of migration and mixing far more complex than earlier historians imagined. Ancient hunter-gatherers, early farmers, and steppe pastoralists all contributed ancestry to modern populations in varying proportions. Similar stories emerged across Asia, Africa, and the Americas. The deeper scientists looked into human genetics, the more interconnected humanity appeared. Blood systems like the Rh factor became part of this expanding map of ancient human movement. There is something quietly emotional about the idea that ordinary biology carries memory. A modern person walking through a crowded city may unknowingly carry inherited traces from prehistoric communities that survived ice ages, crossed mountains, or lived beside rivers that changed course thousands of years ago. None of those ancestors imagined laboratories, genetics, or modern nations. Yet fragments of their biology remain active in living descendants. Rh negative blood is meaningful not because it proves supernatural origins, but because it demonstrates how deeply the past survives inside the present. Human beings are connected to ancient history physically, not only culturally. The body itself preserves continuity across time. Scientists sometimes compare genetics to archaeology, but the comparison only goes so far. Archaeology studies objects left behind. Genetics studies inheritance still alive today. Ancient DNA research revealed that the past never fully vanished. It continues moving through living populations in altered forms, shaped by countless generations of mixing and migration. Even traits considered relatively rare, such as Rh negative blood, exist because long chains of inheritance carried them successfully across immense stretches of time. Every living person represents an unbroken biological connection reaching backward through thousands of generations. Most of those ancestors are forgotten completely, yet their survival remains embedded within the present. Perhaps this explains why blood retains such symbolic power, even in modern scientific societies. Ancient cultures sensed that blood connected generations together, though they expressed the idea through myth and sacred tradition. Modern genetics translated that intuition into molecular evidence. Blood truly does carry history, not as destiny or mystical essence, but as inherited continuity. Hidden beneath ordinary life are biological echoes of ancient migrations, isolated communities, and forgotten human worlds. Rh negative blood became one visible reminder of that deeper truth, a small variation pointing toward the immense age and complexity quietly flowing through every human body. For centuries, the ancient past seemed permanently silent. Archaeologists could uncover tools, pottery, bones, and ruins, but many deeper questions remained unanswered. Who were these people genetically? Where had they come from before settling in a region? Which modern populations were connected to them? Traditional history often relied on educated guesses built from language, artifacts, and geography alone. Then, during the late 20th and early 21st centuries, genetics transformed the study of human history completely. Scientists learned how to extract and analyze ancient DNA from human remains preserved for thousands of years. Suddenly, the dead could speak again through biology. This development became one of the most important scientific revolutions in the study of human origins. Ancient DNA research changed historical understanding because it revealed that many earlier assumptions were incomplete or incorrect. In Europe, for example, historians once debated whether farming spread mainly through cultural exchange or through migration. Genetic evidence showed that large movements of farming populations from Anatolia and the Near East contributed substantially to the ancestry of later Europeans. Later discoveries revealed additional migration waves from the Eurasian steppe during the Bronze Age, reshaping populations again. Human history turned out to be far more dynamic than earlier models suggested. Populations did not remain isolated permanently. They moved, mixed, disappeared, and reformed continuously across prehistoric time. Blood systems such as the Rh factor became part of this broader genetic map. Ancient DNA research does not focus exclusively on blood types, but inherited markers like Rh status still contribute to understanding how populations changed over time. Scientists now combine full genome sequencing with older population markers to reconstruct migration patterns with increasing detail. Rh-negative blood itself likely traveled through multiple ancient groups as populations expanded, mixed, and sometimes became isolated again. No single lost civilization created the trait. Instead, it survived through ordinary human reproduction across vast spans of time and geography. One of the most extraordinary aspects of ancient DNA research is how small discoveries can completely alter historical narratives. A single bone fragment from a cave or burial site may reveal the existence of previously unknown populations. Genetic analysis uncovered entire groups of ancient humans that historians barely suspected only decades ago. The Denisovans, for example, were identified largely through DNA evidence extracted from fragmentary remains in Siberia. Modern humans living today still carry small percentages of Denisovan ancestry in some regions of the world. Similar discoveries continue reshaping understanding of prehistoric Europe, Asia, and the Americas. The deeper scientists investigate, the more layered and interconnected human history becomes. This constant revision can feel unsettling because people often prefer stable origin stories. Nations, cultures, and families usually tell simplified narratives about where they came from. Genetics complicates those stories. Ancient ancestry rarely follows modern borders or identities neatly. Populations that appear separate today often share deep biological connections in the distant past. Human history resembles braided rivers more than isolated lines. Rh-negative blood exists within that fluid landscape of migration and inheritance rather than outside it. The body remembers movements that written history forgot. There is also something deeply humbling about the scale of time revealed through genetics. Ancient DNA research stretches human perspective far beyond the rise of modern civilization. Researchers study individuals who lived before pyramids, kingdoms, or recorded religion existed. Some ancient populations vanished culturally thousands of years ago, yet fragments of their ancestry remain alive inside people walking through the modern world today. Every genetic discovery reminds scientists that human beings are part of an ongoing story far older and more complicated than most societies once imagined. Rh-negative blood became meaningful within this context because it hinted at how ancient demographic patterns can survive invisibly through countless generations. Perhaps the greatest lesson of the ancient DNA revolution is that the past is never truly finished. New evidence continues emerging from caves, graves, frozen landscapes, and forgotten burial grounds across the world. Each discovery reshapes understanding not only of history, but of identity itself. Human beings once believed they could divide the world neatly into separate origins and fixed bloodlines. Genetics instead revealed continuity, mixing, migration, and shared ancestry, on a scale almost impossible to fully comprehend. Hidden inside every Laspiridae are echoes of journeys that began long before memory, still moving quietly forward through time. Modern genetics has revealed something ancient people could only sense intuitively. Every human body is carrying history, not metaphorically, but physically. Hidden inside DNA are traces of migrations, survival, adaptation, isolation, and ancestry stretching backward across immense spans of time. A person living in the modern world may unknowingly carry inherited fragments from ancient farmers, Ice Age hunter-gatherers, nomadic steppe populations, or forgotten communities that vanished thousands of years ago. Most of those ancestors left no names behind. Their languages disappeared. Their homes collapsed into earth and dust. Yet parts of them continue quietly inside living descendants. Rack's negative blood became emotionally powerful, partly because it reminded people of this invisible continuity between the distant past and the present moment. For much of history, people imagined ancestry in relatively simple ways. Families traced lineages through fathers, dynasties, or tribal identity. Nations later created stories about common origins and shared blood. Genetics complicated these ideas enormously. Every individual inherits ancestry from countless lines simultaneously. With each generation, the number of ancestors doubles rapidly. Go back only a few thousand years and the number becomes almost impossible to comprehend. Human populations mixed repeatedly across continents over vast stretches of time. The result is not isolated purity but layered continuity. Modern bodies contain biological echoes from countless forgotten lives, woven together through inheritance. Blood systems, such as the Rh factor, are only tiny fragments inside that enormous inheritance network, yet they remind scientists how ancient and interconnected humanity truly is. There is something strangely intimate about this realization. History often feels distant because it is taught through empires, wars, and famous names. Genetics changes the emotional perspective. Suddenly, ancient history is no longer separate from ordinary people. It survives physically inside them. A person walking quietly through a modern city may carry inherited variations shaped by environmental conditions or migration events that occurred before written language even existed. Reach negative blood became fascinating because it seemed to point directly toward that hidden depth beneath everyday life. Not because it proves secret ancestry, but because it reveals how much of the human story remains alive in subtle biological form. Ancient people often spoke about blood as though it carried memory. In a symbolic sense, modern science showed they were partly correct. Blood does not preserve conscious memories, but it preserves inheritance. Through inheritance, ancient history survives materially across generations. The body becomes a bridge connecting people to worlds they will never fully know. This understanding creates both wonder and humility. Every living person exists because countless ancestors survived long enough to pass life forward through unimaginable stretches of hardship, migration, disease, climate change, and uncertainty. Human existence itself is evidence of survival chains, extending deep into prehistory. At the same time, genetics also dissolves many myths about separation. The deeper scientists study ancestry, the more connected humanity appears. Populations once considered isolated often share ancient relationships. Migration repeatedly blurred boundaries across history. Modern humans carry overlapping ancestries shaped by constant movement rather than permanent division. Rh-negative blood may vary in frequency between populations, but it exists within one shared human species bound together through common evolutionary origins. The emotional fascination surrounding blood often comes from the tension between individuality and connection. People want to feel unique, yet they also long to belong to something larger than themselves. Ancestry offers both at once. Each person inherits a singular genetic path while remaining linked to humanity's collective past. Rh-negative blood became symbolic, partly because it seemed to make hidden ancestry visible. Yet the deeper lesson may be broader and more universal. Every human body carries ancient worlds within it. Every population preserves fragments of journeys nobody remembers completely anymore. Perhaps this is why the study of blood continues affecting people emotionally, even in an age of advanced science. Beneath medicine and genetics lies a quieter realization. The past is not gone. It flows silently through the present, carried inside ordinary lives that rarely notice how many forgotten generations still survive beneath the surface of their own existence. Across history, few things have carried more emotional weight than the idea of blood. Long before laboratories identified blood groups or scientists mapped human DNA, people already treated blood as a symbol of identity, kinship, and belonging. Families spoke about shared blood as proof of connection. Kingdoms defended bloodlines to protect inheritance and legitimacy. Religions used blood in rituals connected to sacrifice, purity, or covenant. Even ordinary language preserved these associations. People still speak of blood relatives, blood ties, or the same blood when describing deep connection between individuals. Ancient societies did not understand genetics scientifically, yet they sensed that blood represented continuity between generations. Modern science eventually confirmed part of that intuition, though in a far more complex way than earlier civilizations imagined. Rh-negative blood became emotionally fascinating, partly because it touched this ancient symbolic layer hidden beneath modern biology. Human beings seem naturally drawn toward questions of origin. Children ask where they came from long before they understand history or genetics. Entire cultures build stories explaining ancestral beginnings. Nations create myths about founding populations. Families preserve genealogies across generations. This desire goes deeper than simple curiosity. Knowing where one comes from helps create psychological stability. Identity feels stronger when connected to a larger story extending backward through time. In uncertain periods especially, people often turn toward ancestry, searching for meaning, continuity, or belonging. Blood became a powerful symbol for these emotional needs because it feels both personal and inherited at the same time. It exists inside the body yet links individuals to previous generations invisibly. Modern genetics intensified this emotional relationship with ancestry. Before DNA testing existed, most people understood family history only through memory, documents, or oral tradition. Today, genetic analysis can reveal ancestral connections stretching across continents and centuries. Many people experience strong emotional reactions when discovering unexpected ancestry results, because identity is never purely biological. It also involves culture, memory, and personal narrative. Rh-negative blood entered this emotional landscape as a visible inherited trait that seemed connected to hidden historical depth. Even people who reject conspiracy theories often feel a quiet fascination when learning they carry an uncommon blood type. Rarity itself creates emotional significance. There is also a deeper human tension involved in ancestry. People want both individuality and belonging simultaneously. They want to feel unique, but not disconnected. Blood symbolism satisfies both desires. Shared ancestry creates connection to family or humanity, while unusual inherited traits create a sense of distinctiveness. Throughout history, societies repeatedly transform this balance into stories about noble bloodlines, sacred ancestry, or chosen groups. Modern science dismantled many of those myths scientifically, yet the emotional structure behind them remains deeply human. Rh-negative blood became a modern version of this older pattern because it seemed to offer both rarity and ancient connection at once. Yet genetics also challenges some comforting assumptions about identity. The deeper scientists study human ancestry, the harder it becomes to draw simple boundaries between populations. Human history is filled with migration, mixing, adaptation, and movement. Most modern populations contain ancestry from multiple ancient groups. The idea of perfectly pure bloodlines surviving untouched through history belongs more to mythology than reality. This scientific perspective can feel emotionally unsettling because people often prefer stable identities and clear origins. But it can also feel strangely liberating. Beneath differences in culture or geography, humanity remains profoundly interconnected through shared ancestry stretching back across prehistoric time. Blood, therefore, carries two meanings simultaneously. It reminds people of personal inheritance and family continuity, but it also reveals how deeply connected human beings are to one another through ancient shared origins. Rh-negative blood fascinates people, not because it separates them from humanity, but because it draws attention to inheritance itself. It reminds modern individuals that history survives inside the body in quiet, invisible ways. Perhaps this explains why the emotional power of blood has never fully disappeared, even in an age dominated by science and technology. Beneath modern life remains an ancient human desire to understand identity through continuity, to feel connected to those who came before, and to believe that something of the distant past still lives silently within the present. In recent years, millions of people around the world have mailed small saliva samples to ancestry testing companies, hoping to discover something hidden about themselves. What began as a scientific service gradually became a cultural phenomenon. Advertisements promised glimpses into forgotten origins, distant migrations, and lost family connections. People opened results pages searching for pieces of identity buried inside percentages and regional maps. Some discovered expected histories. Others encountered surprises that reshaped how they viewed family, ethnicity, or belonging. This modern fascination with ancestry reveals something important about human psychology. Even in technologically advanced societies, people still feel a deep emotional need to understand where they come from. Genetics did not create that desire. It simply gave the ancient question a new scientific language. Blood and DNA became modern pathways toward older human longings about identity and continuity. Rh negative blood exists within this larger cultural movement toward biological self-understanding. For most of human history, identity was shaped primarily by local community, religion, language, and family tradition. A person usually inherited the story of who they were from the society around them. Modern globalization changed that experience dramatically. Migration, urbanization, and digital life weakened many traditional forms of belonging. Families became geographically scattered. Cultural identities blended together more rapidly. In response, many people turned toward ancestry testing, searching for stability and rootedness. DNA seemed to offer something objective beneath the uncertainty of modern life, a biological connection to deeper history that could not easily disappear. Yet ancestry testing also revealed how complicated identity truly is. Results rarely produce neat or isolated origins. Instead, they often uncover layers of migration and mixture spanning multiple regions and populations. A person identifying strongly with one national or cultural identity may discover ancestry from several distant places. Genetics repeatedly demonstrates that human history involves movement far more than separation. The deeper researchers examine ancestry, the more interconnected humanity appears. This realization can feel exciting, but also emotionally disorienting. Many people unconsciously expect ancestry to confirm simple stories about themselves. Instead, genetics often reveals complexity. Rh-negative blood became emotionally interesting within this environment because it seemed to provide a clearer biological marker amid complicated ancestry narratives. A person may receive ancestry results spanning multiple populations and historical migrations, yet their blood type feels immediate and personal. It belongs physically to the body itself. This partly explains why uncommon blood types attract fascination beyond their medical significance. They create a sense of tangible, inherited uniqueness in a world where identity often feels fluid and uncertain. Internet communities discussing Rh-negative blood frequently reflect this emotional search for meaning rather than purely scientific curiosity. People ask not only what the trait is, but what it says about who they are. Modern genetics, however, continues offering a humbling perspective. Identity cannot be reduced to a single gene, blood type, or ancestry percentage. Human beings are shaped by biology, culture, memory, language, geography, and lived experience all at once. DNA provides one layer of the story, but not the entire story itself. The emotional danger appears when inherited traits become transformed into rigid ideas about superiority, purity, or destiny. History repeatedly demonstrated how harmful such thinking can become. Yet the desire to feel connected to the past is not harmful by itself. In many ways, it is deeply human. Perhaps the growing obsession with ancestry reflects a modern form of homesickness. In rapidly changing societies, people search for continuity beneath instability. Genetics offers evidence that modern individuals are connected to ancient human journeys larger than their own lives. Blood systems such as the Rh factor became symbolic because they seem to make invisible inheritance visible. They remind people that history is not fully external. It survives internally as well. The body becomes a quiet meeting point between past and present, and maybe that is why blood continues carrying emotional power even after science explained much of its biology. Beneath the data and laboratory terminology remains an older human feeling, the longing to believe that our lives are part of a story stretching far beyond the brief moment we occupy in time. For thousands of years, human beings have looked at blood and imagined that it carried something deeper than biology alone. Ancient societies connected blood to spirit, family, inheritance, and destiny, because they sensed that generations were linked through invisible continuity. Modern science eventually removed much of the mystery surrounding blood systems, yet it also revealed something unexpectedly profound. The ancients were not entirely wrong about continuity itself. Blood does connect the living to the distant past, though not through sacred magic or hidden superiority. It connects people through inheritance, survival, and shared human history unfolding across immense stretches of time. Rh negative blood became emotionally powerful because it sits at the intersection of those two perspectives. It is scientifically ordinary in one sense, yet symbolically extraordinary in another. The scientific reality surrounding Rh negative blood is now far clearer than it once was. Researchers understand the genetic mechanisms behind the trait. Medicine successfully manages most complications linked to Rh incompatibility. Population genetics explains much of its uneven distribution through migration, isolation, inheritance, and demographic history. The major mysteries once surrounding the Rh factor have gradually narrowed under scientific investigation. Yet despite this progress, the fascination remains. People continue searching for meaning inside ancestry because the emotional questions were never purely scientific to begin with. They are questions about identity, belonging, continuity, and mortality. Human beings want to understand how they fit inside the larger human story. Blood became symbolic because it seemed to carry pieces of that answer invisibly through generations. Modern genetics transformed this symbolism rather than destroying it. DNA research revealed that ancient history survives physically inside living people. Every individual carries inherited traces from countless forgotten ancestors. The body itself became evidence that the past never fully disappears. This realization changes how many people experience history emotionally. Ancient civilizations are no longer only distant subjects described in books or museums. Their descendants still walk through the modern world carrying fragments of prehistoric journeys inside their cells. Rh negative blood attracted fascination, partly because it highlighted this hidden continuity in a visible way. Yet perhaps the most meaningful lesson from genetics is not about rarity at all. It is about connection. The deeper scientists study human ancestry, the more intertwined humanity becomes. Migration repeatedly crossed boundaries that later societies imagined as permanent. Ancient populations mixed, separated, adapted, and reconnected across thousands of years. Every living person exists because unbroken chains of survival carried life forward through unimaginable stretches of time. No bloodline stands outside that shared human inheritance. Even traits considered unusual belong to the broader story of one interconnected species shaped by movement and adaptation. At the same time, the emotional power of ancestry should not be dismissed as irrational. People search for roots because modern life often feels unstable and temporary. Technology changes rapidly, cultures shift, entire ways of life disappear within generations. In such a world, ancestry offers continuity. Blood and genetics become reminders that modern humans are connected to something older and larger than themselves. The danger begins only when that search for continuity transforms into myths about superiority or separation. History repeatedly showed how destructive such ideas can become. But curiosity about origins itself remains deeply human. Perhaps that is why the mystery surrounding Rh negative blood never fully disappears, even after science explains much of it. The fascination is not only about one blood type, it reflects a larger human longing to feel connected to the hidden depth of history itself. Beneath everyday life, people sense that ancient worlds still survive quietly within them. And in a way, they do. Every heartbeat carries inherited echoes from lives that vanished long ago, from journeys nobody remembers anymore, from ancestors who crossed landscapes that no longer exist in the same form. The past continues moving silently through the present, not as myth or prophecy, but as living continuity carried inside ordinary human blood. Even after centuries of study, humanity still lives beside enormous uncertainty. Modern science has explained many mysteries that once seemed impossible to understand. Humans learned how blood circulates through the body, how inheritance works through genes, and how ancient ancestry can be traced through DNA preserved across thousands of years. Diseases that once terrified entire civilizations are now preventable or treatable. Telescopes can observe galaxies billions of light years away. Ancient human migrations can be reconstructed from fragments of bone buried beneath the earth for millennia. And yet, the deeper knowledge becomes, the more clearly people begin to see how much still remains unresolved. Rh negative blood exists inside that larger reality. Science explained much of its biology, but not every detail of its ancient journey through human history. Some questions may eventually receive clearer answers, Others may remain permanently incomplete. Human knowledge itself has limits shaped by time, evidence, and the fragile survival of history. Much of the ancient world disappeared without leaving records behind. Entire populations vanished before writing emerged. Languages were lost, burial sites eroded. Climate, war, and time erased countless traces of human existence long before modern researchers could study them. Genetics recovered fragments of that lost world, but fragments are not the same as complete understanding. Scientists can estimate migration patterns, population relationships, and inheritance probabilities with increasing sophistication. Yet no living person can fully reconstruct every ancient life that contributed to the present. The deeper researchers investigate human origins, the more complex the story becomes. Earlier generations often expected science to eventually provide simple final answers about humanity. Modern genetics instead revealed overlapping ancestries, repeated migrations, and histories far more interconnected than once imagined. In this sense, mystery did not disappear. It evolved. Rh-negative blood became culturally fascinating, partly because it symbolized this tension between knowledge and uncertainty. People encountered a real biological trait carrying visible historical patterns, yet surrounded by unanswered questions large enough for imagination to enter. Some responded with scientific curiosity, others turned toward mythology or conspiracy. Both reactions emerged from the same human discomfort with incomplete explanations. But perhaps uncertainty itself is not a flaw in human understanding. Perhaps it is an unavoidable part of studying beings as ancient and complex as ourselves. The human species evolved across enormous spans of time. Modern civilization represents only a tiny moment within that longer history. Most ancient human experiences vanished long before written memory began. What survives today are scattered traces, bones, tools, languages, myths, and inherited biology carried silently forward through generations. Rh-negative blood is one of those traces. Not a magical clue pointing outside humanity, but a reminder that the past still survives inside the present, in ways people are only beginning to understand clearly. There is something strangely peaceful about accepting that some mysteries may never fully close. Modern culture often treats uncertainty as something temporary that must eventually disappear. Yet throughout history, humans always lived with unanswered questions about existence, origin, and identity. Ancient people looked at the stars without understanding what they truly were. Future generations may one day view current scientific knowledge with similar humility. What feels advanced now may later appear incomplete. The search for understanding continues because human curiosity continues, not because perfect certainty is guaranteed. In the end, Rh-negative blood may matter less for the answers it provides than for the perspective it encourages. It reminds people that ordinary human bodies contain hidden depth, extending far beyond individual lifetimes. Every person carries inheritance from forgotten worlds they will never fully know. Beneath modern identity flows an ancient biological continuity, stretching backward through migrations, survival, and countless unnamed generations. The mystery remains not because science failed, but because humanity itself is larger, older, and more interconnected than any single explanation can fully contain. Every human life occupies only a brief moment in time. A single person may live decades, remember fragments of childhood, witness social change, raise families, and eventually disappear into history like countless generations before them. Yet beneath this temporary existence flows something far older and more continuous. Long before modern nations, religions, or written language existed, human beings were already carrying inheritance forward through endless chains of survival. Ancient people crossed frozen landscapes during ice ages, adapted to changing climates, survived famine and migration, and passed life onward without knowing that traces of their existence would still survive inside distant descendants thousands of years later. Modern genetics reveal that every living person is, in a sense, a temporary carrier of ancient history. Rh-negative blood became emotionally significant because it drew attention to this invisible continuity hidden beneath ordinary life. Most ancestors are forgotten quickly. Names vanish within a few generations, languages disappear, entire cultures collapse or merge into others over time. History remembers only a tiny fraction of humanity. Yet biology remembers differently. DNA preserves fragments of countless forgotten lives, whether history records them or not. A person living today may unknowingly carry inherited variations shaped by environmental conditions, migrations, or isolated populations that existed before recorded civilization began. Blood systems such as the Rh factor are part of that inheritance network moving quietly through time. The body becomes a living bridge between worlds separated by thousands of years. There is something deeply humbling about this perspective. Modern people often experience themselves as isolated individuals moving through fast-changing societies. Daily life becomes filled with immediate concerns, technology, work, and personal identity. Genetics quietly reveals another scale of existence operating beneath those experiences. Every human being represents the survival of unbroken ancestral chains, stretching backward through immense prehistoric time. Countless lives, decisions, relationships, and acts of survival were required for any modern person to exist at all. The overwhelming majority of those ancestors will never be known individually, yet pieces of them continue living invisibly inside future generations. Ancient cultures often tried expressing this continuity through myths about bloodlines, sacred ancestry, or eternal family connections. Modern science replaced many supernatural explanations, but it did not erase the emotional truth underneath them. Human beings really are connected across time through inheritance. The past survives materially inside the present. Rich negative blood fascinated people because it seemed to make that hidden continuity visible for a moment, not as proof of secret destiny, but as evidence that history never fully disappears. Inheritance carries echoes of ancient worlds silently forward long after memory fades. At the same time, genetics also changes how people think about individuality itself. No person exists independently from the immense network of human ancestry surrounding them. Every individual is both unique and deeply connected to others through shared origins. Ancient migration blurred boundaries repeatedly across history. Populations mixed, separated, and reconnected over thousands of years. Modern humans inherited this layered complexity, whether they realize it or not. The deeper scientists study ancestry, the more difficult it becomes to divide humanity into simple categories. Blood systems vary, cultures differ, histories diverge, yet beneath all of it remains one interconnected species carrying ancient continuity together through time. Perhaps this is why the study of blood and ancestry affects people emotionally, even when approached scientifically. It reminds them that existence extends beyond a single lifetime. Inside ordinary biology survives evidence of journeys that began long before modern civilization emerged. Every heartbeat continues, processes shaped by countless forgotten generations. Rh negative blood is only one small variation within that larger story, yet it became symbolic because it points towards something many people quietly sense already. Human life may be temporary, but humanity itself is ancient beyond ordinary imagination. The past is not dead beneath the surface of the present. It is still moving, still flowing, still surviving invisibly through living bodies carrying fragments of worlds that disappeared long ago beneath the endless movement of time. For most of human history, blood was treated as a mystery, long before it became a science. Ancient people saw it as sacred because they sensed it carried life, inheritance, and continuity through generations they could barely imagine. Modern genetics eventually explained many of the biological mechanisms hidden inside blood, yet the deeper emotional mystery never disappeared completely. Rh negative blood became one small window into that larger human story. Not proof of lost civilizations, hidden species, or supernatural ancestry, but evidence that the past survives inside the present in quiet and complicated ways. Across this journey, science answered many questions while leaving others unfinished. Researchers explained how the Rh factor works biologically. Population genetics revealed how migration, isolation, inheritance, and time shaped its distribution across the world. Ancient DNA studies showed that humanity itself is far older, more connected, and more intertwined than earlier civilizations understood. At the same time, uncertainty remained. Some ancient paths disappeared beyond recovery. Some origins can only be estimated indirectly through fragments that survived. Human history stretches too far backward for complete certainty to exist. And perhaps that is not a failure of science, but a reflection of how vast the human story truly is. Throughout this exploration, one truth slowly emerged beneath the myths and speculation. Blood does not separate humanity into higher and lower origins. It reveals connection more than division. Every human being carries inherited traces from forgotten generations who survived long enough to pass life forward. Every population contains echoes of migration, adaptation, struggle, and survival, shaped across thousands of years. Reach negative blood is one variation within that larger shared inheritance, a reminder that ancient history still moves invisibly beneath modern life. The fascination surrounding blood often says more about human longing than biology itself. People search for hidden ancestry because they want continuity in a changing world. They want to feel connected to something older than themselves. They want to believe their lives belong to a story larger than a single lifetime. In that sense, the enduring mystery of Rh negative blood reflects something deeply human, not a search for superiority, but a search for belonging inside the immense timeline of existence. Modern science offers an important lesson here. Curiosity is valuable when guided by evidence, humility, and care for truth. Human genetics can deepen understanding of ancestry, migration, and shared history without turning inherited differences into myths about destiny or worth. The more researchers learn about humanity, the more interconnected people appear. Ancient divisions become less certain. Shared origins become harder to ignore. Beneath culture, geography, and blood variation exists one species shaped together through survival across deep time. Perhaps the greatest value of studying mysteries like Rh negative blood is not discovering a final dramatic answer. It is learning how to live thoughtfully beside uncertainty. Science continues searching. New discoveries will emerge. Ancient DNA research may reshape parts of this story again in the future. Yet even without complete answers, the search itself teaches something meaningful about humanity. It teaches patience with complexity, respect for evidence, humility before the vastness of history, an awareness that every living person carries invisible connections to countless forgotten lives stretching backward through time. Tonight, somewhere beneath the noise of the modern world, billions of human hearts continue beating quietly in the dark. Different languages, different nations, different histories. Yet beneath the surface, the same ancient inheritance still flows through all of them, carrying fragments of journeys older than memory itself. And perhaps the strangest part is this. After everything science has discovered about blood, genes, and human origins, one question still remains gently open in the silence. When you look into your own history, how much of who you are truly belongs only to you, and how much was already travelling through time long before you were ever born?